Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the What If Guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the second part of What If Issei Got Harem with Kendo Girls. Now before starting, please give this video a like, and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Issei was sprinting down the streets of Kyoto town, getting an early morning workout before the sun rose. He ran from his house all the way to Kyoto Academy at a full sprint, something he never imagined he'd be able to do without even breaking a sweat. So when he got to the school without feeling winded as he normally would, he continued on and ran into town. Issei was lost in a conversation with Reya as he made his way through town. What was with all those smells in my room? Issei asked, remembering the mixture of unfamiliar scents in his room when he woke up. The smell of azaleas was the most prominent. Issei turned a corner to loop back around to his home so he wouldn't be late to get ready for school. Reya said in Issei's mind. Natural-born dragons would never have that problem, because they are born with that enhanced sense, but someone who had suddenly gained it would have to adjust. That'll come in handy. Katase and murayama will have a harder time sneaking up on me now. Although I probably shouldn't tell them that I can smell them. That could sound kinda stalkerish. Issei paused in his run as a car was going through the intersection he was looking to cross. He quickly picked the pace back up once it was gone. The sun was starting to come over the horizon, telling Issei to hurry home and get ready for his first day as a devil dragon. Is there a reason why you and Elsha both started to feel different to me the longer we trained last night? Issei asked the dragon. During the training in his sacred gear, even though he'd only just met Elsha and Reya, they felt like he'd known them all his life. Almost like family. Reya chuckled at his host's question, knowing the feeling he was talking about. Reya's explanation made Issei almost trip over the curb he was stepping over as he ran his way home. Issei was lost in thought on his run, thinking of just how much his life had been changed in the last 24 hours. Issei wiped the perspiration off of his brow, noticing that he was only slightly winded, as he opened the door to his home and stepped inside. Once inside, he took his running shoes off and walked into the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water to quench the thirst that built up from his run. Downing the bottle in a matter of seconds, Issei took a deep breath, feeling recovered from his long run. Issei's nostrils flared from the smell of wintergreen that seemed to be getting stronger. Then he heard footsteps coming from the stairs. He turned to face whoever it was. Momo turned the corner into the kitchen, and her eyes widened in relief at seeing Issei. She darted towards him. Momo wrapped her arms around his waist and held on tightly. There you are, Eyes. I started getting worried when I saw you weren't in bed, Momo said as she released a breath of relief as she felt the radiant warmth coming from Issei's body. Issei's nose was still being assaulted by the pleasant smell of wintergreen as he felt his heart start to race from the close contact to Momo. Issei returned the hug before coming to the realization that he had no idea why she was in his house. Issei took Momo by the shoulders and moved her a foot away so that he could make eye contact with her to ask his question. Momo looked a little upset and confused when Issei removed her from holding onto him. Momo, why are you here so early? He asked. Momo tilted her head to the side, forgetting that Issei hadn't been aware of the conversation on who would stay at his house last night due to being passed out. I stayed to make sure that nothing happened to you overnight. Elsha told us that you'd be fine by morning, but we wanted to be sure. So how are you feeling? Momo said with a smile, getting the impression that Eyes wasn't having any negative side effects. Issei rubbed the back of his head, feeling a little embarrassed that his fainting episode yesterday had interrupted a few people's evenings. Oh, thanks for keeping an eye on me. I feel fine now. Nothing feels out of place at the moment, just some new sensations to get used to is all. Issei replied with a nervous chuckle at the end. New sensations? Momo asked curiously. Issei didn't answer the question as he had picked up on the scent that was the heaviest in his room when he woke up, azaleas. Issei turned his head towards the kitchen doorway, hearing the footsteps coming closer and the scent stronger. Issei saw Katase come around the corner, stretching her arms above her head, making her chest more pronounced through the loose pajamas. Issei felt his heart rate quicken again, taking in every millisecond of the pink-haired girl's actions. Issei smiled towards Katase as she relaxed her arms, eyes closed and walking towards Issei, not realizing he was there. Good morning, he said with a small wave, making Katase jump a little at the sudden unexpected voice. Katase opened her eyes quickly and spotted Issei standing in the kitchen with his hand on Momo's shoulder. Her surprise quickly turned into suspicion, recalling when she found Momo on top of Isseiing him. She walked with heavy feet towards the two, her eyes switching between them and a hand on her hips. Her gaze finally settled on Issei. Eyes, isn't it a bit too early for your hormones to be getting the better of you? She asked accusingly. Issei blinked in confusion at what Katase was getting at, then glanced towards Momo, seeing his hand still on Momo, quickly retracting it as he felt his face heat up. He waved his hands in defense. It's not what you think. I swear I was just asking her why she was here so early, Issei defended. Katase was slightly appeased, but still a bit suspicious of what was going on. But she was certain that Eyes wouldn't lie to her about something like this. Momo, on the other hand, had a slight pout on her face. She poked Eyes in the side to regain his attention. Issei jumped a bit at the sudden finger in his ribs. Eyes, you didn't answer my question. What new sensations were you talking about? She restated her question. Elsha hadn't elaborated too much on the specifics on what changes would happen with Ai's body, only that he'd be more likely to give in to any primal urges. That was something she was quietly in agreement with Reya in. She wanted to see just how far to the edge she could bring Ai, but this wasn't the right moment for that. Issei rubbed the back of head once more, thinking that any girl wouldn't react well to hearing that he could smell them from a far distance. That just didn't sound like a conversation with a good ending. But Issei always made it a point to tell the truth, no matter if it got him in trouble. You and Drake told me that I have a dragon's sense of hearing and smell. So when I came back from my run this morning, I could smell wintergreen once you left the guest room and started coming downstairs. And azaleas when you came down, Issei said, his eyes finding the kitchen window more interesting than anything else at the moment. As Issei stared at the window, both Momo and Katase stood there with wide eyes and blushed faces. Katase wasn't sure what came over her, but she walked up to Ai and took his left hand in her right, squeezing it gently before looking at him when his face came back from staring at the window. So you're feeling relatively normal, no weird pains or after effects? She asked hesitantly, the embarrassment of her actions coming to her in full force. Issei squeezed her hand back, gently so as not to hurt her. I feel great. No problems to speak of. Line break. Issei walked into the school gates with Katase and Momo on either side of him. He had been holding his nose for the last 100 feet as they drew near the mass of people. Momo and Katase both looked at Issei and held back a laugh at his reaction. Katase calmed herself down first, wiping a tear away. She asked, something smell funny? Eyes. Issei shook his head, his hand not leaving his nose. There's too many. It's like I walked into a warehouse of bars of scentless soap, he said. His voice had a nasal tone as he blocked out as much of the smells as he could, which was only helping a little bit. So we have distinct scents while the people here don't? Momo asked as she saw Issei's head nod, removing his hand from his nose. I suppose I need to get used to it. Can't be holding my nose closed my entire high school career. Something smells like cinnamon, he said as he turned to look behind them. The two girls rose eyebrows at that statement, then turned to follow his line of sight. They saw Murayama coming through the school gates behind them. Once she saw Ai and Katase, she ran up to them. Ai, how are you feeling? She asked, concerned, her attention focused solely on him. Issei rubbed the back of his head with a smile. He was about to assure her that he was feeling fine, but Katase and Momo saw an opportunity to tease both Issei and Murayama. I'd say he's better than ever. He even has a new trick up his sleeve, Momo said. Yeah, and apparently you smell like cinnamon to him, Katase said. Both girls gained sly smirks as Murayama's face lit up a bright red. The narrowed glare Murayama gave Ai was hard to take serious with her extreme blush. She stepped forward towards Issei, her right index finger poking into his chest. And just how did you come to that conclusion? You didn't steal some of my clothes when I wasn't looking, did you? Her accusation made Issei go on the defensive. He took a few steps back, hands raised. I didn't do anything like that. My nose is really sensitive now. I smelled cinnamon and when I turned around it was you, Issei said quickly, then shooting the other two girls a glare of his own. You can't just say something like that without context. It makes me sound like some kind of deranged pervert, Issei said with crossed arms at the two girls next to him. Murayama stepped back, her face starting to return to its normal color. Notice they only had a few minutes before the first classes began. She set her eyes back onto Ai. A wave of relief flooded over her, seeing that he was all right and with the same personality that she came to enjoy. But then the conversation with her parents last night came to her, making her face turning into a poorly hidden frown. Katase watched Murayama's frown, hoping she was wrong about what was making her feel down. Katase stepped towards her brunette friend by the hand and started dragging her away from Issei and Momo towards the kendo room. She turned her head, seeing Murayama's surprised face as she waved to Issei. We have some club stuff to do before class. See you later, Ai, she yelled, turning her head forward and continuing out of sight. Issei and Momo watched the duo leave, confused about the sudden exit. Momo took this chance and dragged Issei away while hugging onto his arm, just as the bell rang to warn students class was starting in a few minutes. Line break. Issei sat in his desk, unaware that the final bell for the day had rung and unaware of all the students leaving the room. His mind was bouncing between two different thoughts. Where Katase and Murayama were, they hadn't met up with him for lunch. And the other was the strange nervous feeling he had been getting right after the lunch break. It was coming from the same place as the feeling of moving water, so Issei thought it had to do with Sona. His eyes locked on the sun through the window at the side of the room. He suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder, making him jump a bit, but calmed down when he saw who it was. You alright, Issei? Kaichu wants to see you. It was Yura, the blue-haired girl from the student council. Once Issei was brought back to reality, the scent of plum flooded his nose. Sorry, was just spacing out a bit, Issei said as he stood up from his seat, walking out with his fellow devil. As they walked down the hall, Issei got the feeling that most of the other girls in Sona's peerage were more familiar with him than he was with them. Hardly knowing someone you might be fighting alongside didn't sound good, so he wanted to get to know each of them better. Maybe this meeting would help with that. I know we haven't really had a chance to talk yet, but I'm looking forward to getting to know you and the other members, Issei said to Yura with a smile. Yura turned to face Issei, returning the smile. Same here, we were all excited that you joined, Kaichu. I think you'll fit in great. I can see why Reya and Momo took a liking to you so quickly, she said, a small laugh at the end. Issei was about to ask what Yura meant by that, but they arrived at the door to the student council. Yura knocked on the door and waited for a few seconds before it was opened by Tsubaki. The tall girl with glasses opened the door fully at seeing her peerage members. Please, come in. Yura walked in first, followed closely by Issei. Yura took her usual spot next to Tamo and Momo. Issei didn't want to seem like the center of attention, so he stood next to Tamo on the side of the room. Sona was looking over a piece of paper that had the same magic circle that she produced when she used her magic, the Citri symbol. Issei could feel that same nervous feeling flare up again, this time a bit stronger, and a building feeling of moving water swelled up with it. Sona's eyes were narrowed as she looked over the paper sent to her by her family. Tsubaki, knowing what this was about, brought Sona out of her reading. Kaichu, everyone is present now. Sona looked up from the paper in her hands, taking control of her emotions again. She stood up from her chair and sat on the front of her desk while she faced her peerage. Her eyes made their way down the line, going from Reya to Momo, then Yura and Tamo, then stopping on Issei. I'm glad to see that you're back on your feet, Issei. I'd like to get right to business, Sona said, taking on her school official persona. All members nodded their heads in agreement. Good. Issei, since you woke, has anything been out of place or different? She asked Issei directly, her violet eyes softening a little as they made eye contact. The nervous feeling she'd been having for a good portion of the day fading as her link to Issei radiated its warmth to her. The first thing I noticed is that my body is warmer. I had a hard time telling if the water in my shower was stuck on lukewarm until I noticed the steam in the room. So I think my skin has already started adapting to the dragons going through my heart, Issei said, recalling the difficulty he had in the shower that morning. All he could really feel was the droplets hitting his skin. There wasn't any recognition of hot or cold. Sona nodded. She wanted a full description of anything Issei felt was different. Maybe something would alter her plans on training. After the delivery of that notice, she'd need to expand the things she'd cover with him and increase the intensity. She'd also need to ask one of the 2 instructors she had in mind for Issei to go to during the week break coming at the end of the month. Anything else? Issei nodded, continuing with the changes he's experiencing, the rest of the peerage listening in interest. Yes, I went out on a run this morning and managed to sprint nearly the whole way from my house to the edge of town and back. Afterwards I was only slightly winded and felt fully recovered after a few minutes. Drake and Elsha told me last night that would happen since I have new lungs with a high capacity. Sona and the rest of the girls in the room rose an eyebrow at that. They didn't know that while he was passed out, Issei was going through the hardest training he'd ever experienced. You were speaking to them last night? Sona asked. Her question was answered by one of the 2 beings in question as a green light flooded the room, coming from Issei's left arm. When the light was gone, the boosted gear was there on his arm, in the form of its second liberation. Drake spoke from Issei's hand. The girls in the room all looked shocked from suddenly hearing a being that was feared throughout all factions. Sona was the most composed, but even she jumped a bit at the deep and powerful voice of the Welsh dragon. Issei looked down to his arm where the gauntlet was. Mornin' Drake. Sona adjusted her glasses that had fallen down to the edge of her nose from being startled, then greeted the new arrival to their conversation. It's an honor to speak to you, Drake. My name is Sona Citri, next heir to the Citri family, she said with a small bow of her head. The girls of her peerage were still a little too shocked to speak, and they didn't feel it was their place to interrupt the conversation. This was between Issei Drake and Sona. Drake said to Sona, getting a reminder that the Norse fire dragon and the Welsh dragon both knew of her sister's antics. So what do you suggest for a training schedule for Issei? Sona responded quickly, wanting to get away from the topic of her childish sister. Sona had the feeling that she wouldn't be able to hide her peerage away from the childish Satan for much longer, but she would try her hardest to hold off that embarrassment. Drake sighed after saying his piece. The one in the familiar forest had only ever gotten along with Elsha of all of his hosts, and it was mostly because they bonded over how many men tried to claim them as their own. So just how she would react was unpredictable. Sona's eyes widened at the mention of having Issei train with 2 dragon kings, especially that the strongest of them might kill her pawn, who hadn't wronged the dragon in the first place. Sona wanted to know just why the only female dragon king would want to kill Issei, but felt that prying into a heavenly dragon's personal life was ill-advised. I see. I can set up a meeting with Tannen, hopefully have them train during Golden Week at the end of the month. For the other, I was planning on bringing him to the familiar forest the following month. Sona had her hand on her chin as she sat on the edge of her desk. She stood from her spot and looked towards Issei again. Issei, let's go outside and test out what your current abilities are at. Line break. Issei stood in the field behind the old school building, getting to show what he'd learned with Drake and Elsha last night, but with more spectators than he'd expected. In front of him was Sona, who had summoned a lion and a giant eagle, both made of clear and pure water. Off to the right were 2 groups of people, the first being his friends in peerage, katase, murayama, momo, Reya, Yuritamo, and Tsubaki. He understood why all of them were there. Katase and Murayama had come out of nowhere in their Kendo uniforms and followed the group when they saw Issei. The other group seemed to be Reya's Gremmary's peerage. Reya's was standing slightly in front of the rest, with a black-haired violet-eyed girl just behind her to the left. Off to Reya's right was a blonde-haired boy with gray eyes and a mole under his left eye, and a short girl with white hair with amber eyes. Everyone was in their school uniforms except for this smaller girl. She was wearing a black shirt and skirt which Issei thought contrasted nicely with her light skin and white hair. "I'm ready, Kaichu," boosted gear, Issei said as he called out his gauntlet. When Reya and her group saw it, they each gasped at seeing one of the top-tier sacred gears that was said to able to grant enough power to shift the balance of the three factions. Murayama and katase also looked at it with awe, finally placing what Issei had said was held inside of him. Sona nodded, raising her left hand into the air. The eagle responded by tucking its head down, looking like it was about to take flight. "All right, let's see how strong your fire is without any boosts first," Sona said as she brought her hand down. The eagle kicked off the ground, flapping its wings and gaining speed towards Issei. The setting sun was glistening through the bird's water body. Issei clenched both fists, took a deep breath in, feeling the heat as his head tilted back ready to set his flames onto his magical opponent. The eagle sped towards Issei at a quick speed, testing how fast he could ready his flame. The bird was only 5 feet in front of him when he leaned forward and released the heated breath he held. Issei's jaw opened and released the dark red fire, a signature of the Red Dragon Emperor, which came barreling out towards the eagle approaching him. Then flames made contact with the water, and a cloud of steam surrounded the area. Neither Issei nor Sona could see through it. When the wind blew the steam away, the water eagle was gone completely. Sona lifted her left hand once more, the steam floating around, condensing and reforming the eagle at her side as it was before. She set her eyes on Issei with a look of surprise and pride. Issei looked a bit winded from that last attack, taking deep breaths through his nose, his chest rising then releasing it through his mouth. "Very good, Issei, now try the lion with one boost," Sona said, raising her right hand to signal the water lion to prepare to run towards Issei. Issei nodded, taking one more breath to regain himself. He raised his gauntlet-clad arm. "Boost," Issei yelled, which was mirrored quickly after with a shout from D-Drag and a green shine from the jewel on the gauntlet. Sona's water lion took off from his spot next to her on all fours. His strides were long, and was closing the distance faster than the eagle had. Issei took in another deep breath, holding it in, and felt the heat build inside. His head titled back, he brought his left arm with the boosted gear over his lungs, and gave the mental command. "Transfer." D-Drag rang out his host command, doubling the size and intensity of the heat Issei felt. The new power of the flames was getting a bit much to hold on to. The lion was now at the same distance the eagle had been when it had been evaporated. Issei leaned forward, ready to turn this water beast into steam as well. Issei released the intense heat from his jaw, sending a torrent of dark red flame spiraling towards the lion. The lion roared towards the enclosing fire, sensing the heat off of it. As the lion and flames met, an explosion of superheated steam covered the area, a cloud much bigger and thicker than the last. Sona used a barrier spell to ward off the heated water from her. She looked to the side to see the group that came with them. Both groups had used their own barriers to protect themselves. Sona's group had covered katase and Murayama from getting hurt since they couldn't protect themselves. Reya's Queen Akino had covered their whole group with a red barrier. Sona raised both hands to dispel the steam. As it cleared, Issei was down on one knee, panting heavily. The veins in his neck were distended, his face red and some sweat on his forehead. Sona's eyes widened at seeing her pawn that just recovered already being possibly hurt. She checked their link as she ran up to him, since the others were still behind barriers. Sona sighed, relieved that he had only exhausted his energy and a bit of first-degree burn from the steam. Issei laid down on his back, still trying to catch his breath. His face spread into a smile and he started laughing. "Ahaha, man. That was hot and exhausting, but mostly hot," he said, his voice weak from lack of air in his lungs. Sona's face split into a smile at Issei as she knelt beside him to make sure he was fine. But his words settled that worry for her. Murayama and katase wanted to run to Issei when they saw him looking like he was about to pass out, but the heat still radiating through the area in front of them made that impossible. Momo and Reya felt the same Murayama and katase, but they knew Sona would help Issei if he needed it. Sona lifted her right hand in front of the lying Issei's face as he opened his eyes. Issei looked at her hand, seeing her thumb held against the tip of her middle finger like it was holding it back. Issei rose an eyebrow towards his king. "Kaichu?" he asked. Sona released her middle finger, flicking Issei on the forehead. Thud. The hit made a surprisingly hollow sound that was heard by everyone, and made katase and Murayama burst out laughing. Sona's eyes turned into a scrutinizing gaze. "Don't worry us like that, you just recovered," she said, her eyes softening as the smile came back. Sona stood up, offering a hand to pick him up off of the floor, which Issei accepted. When Issei was back on his feet, he rubbed the back of his head with a wry smile. "I guess I need to get my boost limit up with fire, that was way too exhausting." Sona nodded, knowing just how that felt. She experienced the same thing when trying to summon her water dragon for the first time. "We'll work on it. It'll be hard, but I can guarantee it'll be worth it." Line break. Issei was tiptoeing down the stairs of his house, trying to make sure he didn't get caught going downstairs by katase, who was staying the night again and would be going back to Murayama's tomorrow after school. He was on a mission to talk to his mother about something he heard before Murayama left them to go see her parents for their last night for the next month. Issei found his mother in the kitchen, drying the last few dishes from dinner, and she hadn't noticed his approach yet. Issei stepped towards her until he was within arm's reach. He lifted his hand and tapped on her shoulder. Need something, sweetie? His mother asked, as she turned and saw her son was trying to get her attention. Mrs. Hayatu put down the plate she was drying, wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face her son. Issei nodded, his left index finger on his lips saying they needed to be quiet. Mrs. Hayatu gained a confused look when she saw this. I need to talk to you about something important, but we need to be quiet. I don't want you to find out and tell Kaori, at least not yet. He said seriously. Okay, what is it? She asked. It must be something important if he didn't even want the two girls he was almost constantly with to know about it. She watched as Issei looked behind them and took a deep breath through his nose before turning back. Issei's eyes were locked with his mother's and held a serious look. Kaori was upset about something this morning at school, but seemed like she didn't want to talk about, but I overheard it after school. Her parents might be selling their house and moving. They won't know for sure until the next time they come to town. They told her she could stay if she can afford to live on her own, but with Kendo that'd be extremely hard. SOI, if it comes to it, can I offer for Kaori and Yui to live here with us? Issei's eyes kept themselves locked on his mother's, looking for any kind of visual cue. He finally got it when her eyes turned from curiosity into a soft smile. I'll have to talk to your father, but I think that'd be fine, she said, smiling, feeling proud of her son, seeing how considerate he was to his friends and not wanting to put himself into a situation that they might not want him involved. Thanks, Mom. Good night. Good night, eyes. Friday, the last day of the school week, had come and gone in a blur to Issei. He could hardly concentrate on the things a normal high school student should be, what with all the rapid changes in his life. The sudden reveal that supernatural beings were real, having a bunch of them in his school. Learning that he had a dragon sealed inside his soul, becoming a devil, and then part dragon almost at the same time. The thought that there was no way he should have been able to mentally absorb all of this as the truth came to mind. But when everything had been proven beyond any reasonable doubt, all he could really do was just take it in stride and move forward. The only thing he could really recall that was even somewhat related to a normal school life was Sona saying that she wanted him to basically a go-between for the class reps and the student council, a position that required little of his time, so he'd be free to join a club of his choosing. He had pretty much decided to join the Kendo club, with Drake, Elsha and Sona urging him to do so. They claimed that knowing how to deal with an opponent armed with a sword would be extremely useful, since supernatural battles tended to be with either magic of melee weapons. Going to get the club membership form had been the first close call Issei had in quite a while since his anti-perv training had started. And had katase and murayama not stepped in, he thought for sure he'd be sporting some new bruises. He had been walking to where the Kendo club met after school each day, lost in a mental conversation with Drake and Elsha about why Kendo was the right choice instead of some sort of martial arts club. Drake had said, and while Issei could agree with him, he still had wanted to argue that he should have at least a basic knowledge of how to act in a fist fight first. But Elsha had brought up a good point other than what the legendary dragon had offered that had convinced him that it was the right decision. If you can learn to read the strikes of a sword, which will be quicker and have a longer reach, reading a strike from a fist will be much easier, eyes. I suppose that makes sense. Still though, I get the feeling that Yui and Kaori are going to get a little too much satisfaction of having another excuse to beat the crap out of me, Issei reasoned. Walking through the campus with his head towards the ground, most students still around just thought he looked lost in thought, oblivious to the fact that he had two voices talking to him in his head. His walk to the Kendo room was coming to a quick close without him realizing it. Only a dozen or so more steps and he'd be at the door. The best training results I ever had were when my opponent held no qualms about possibly inflicting fatal wounds. If you had someone like that to spar against, the results would be much quicker. Oh, well, would you look at that? You might just get a taste now. Elsha spoke. Her tone at first was analytical, but the end was filled with surprise and a hint of mischievous glee. Issei hadn't registered the fact that his hand had already grabbed and turned the door to the Kendo room and had made the first 2 steps inside. The only reason he looked up and around him when he did was due to the echoed gasps that seemed to surround him. His eyes became focused as they came back up, only widened in surprise. The sight hadn't fully registered in his mind, but the sense did. Salt, along with a mixture of wood and various others. 2 were familiar to Issei though. Azaleas and cinnamon, both with a hint of salt to them. As his brain connected to his eyes, Issei realized that he was looking at about a dozen young women in various states of undress. All of them had their eyes locked onto him. Most were still removing their Kendo gear. 3 were walking around in their bra and panties. The girl that looked the most mortified was standing completely bare-chested, bent over to remove the last undergarment, her face bright red and eyes starting to flicker with anger. Issei was shocked stiff, almost like he was frozen in a block of ice, his mind's eye taking picture after picture of the scene before him. Still in his daze, the scent of cinnamon and azaleas crept up from his right eyes. He heard the voice of Murayama vaguely. No response. Hoi, eyes this time katase, a little louder, noticing his unmoving form. The newly born devil, dragon could feel a rapid heat wash over him as those 2 unseen voices walked closer, the salt-laced smells flooding his being. His heart picked up its pace, and a quick spell of lightheadedness came with it. He could swear that the only thing he heard at the moment was his pumping through his veins as his vision seemed to black out for the briefest of moments. 2 hands closed over his shoulders and lightly shook him back and forth. His sight came back, and murayama was standing in front of him in her nearly topless glory with a look of worry across her face. Her bra was unhooked but still on her shoulders, barely containing her larger-than-average breasts. Issei had to bite his cheek as he felt an urge to bite her where her collarbone met her neck. The shock that pain gave him brought him back to reality completely. He slammed his eyes shut tightly, brought his right hand to cover his nose from the intoxicating smell that was overwhelming his senses, and tried to turn around but murayama wouldn't let him. "Sorry, I didn't know you changin' here," he said, loud enough for his voice to carry through the entire room. "This daver," he thought to himself. Murayama and katase looked at their friend and the state he was in. His eyes had been glazed over when they walked over to him. He was almost catatonic. His chest was raising and falling at a fast and uneven rate, and a faint blush came over his cheeks. They looked to each other, shared a silent comment to each other, before murayama removed her hands from his shoulders. She instead grabbed his left hand and started dragging him to the back room where the supplies were kept. "Come on, we'll talk back here so they can change," murayama said gently. "Well damn, I thought for sure that they'd be out for after that little stunt. Eyes, you lady killer. Phew. Although, who knew these two would get such a strong reaction from you?" Elsha chimed in his head. "You're not helping Elsha." Issei mistakenly spoke out loud. Thankfully only katase and murayama had the possibility to hear him, which they did. It dragged him the last few feet to the back room even quicker to find out what was wrong. Now in the back room, the sliding door closed and the whispers of the other members picking back up. Murayama released her hold on Issei, quickly hooking her bra back into place. Apparently D-Drag found his host's situation funny as well. "Eyes, what's wrong? You can open your eyes now." Katase spoke from Murayama's side, both directly in front of him. Issei quickly shook his head, made a little awkward with his hand still covering his nose. "You two are in your underwear. The last time I saw you like this, you beat me till I couldn't see straight." Yeah, that was fun. But we hardly knew each other then. Eyes. You've seen us in bikinis, not much difference other than some lace. Now, open your eyes." Katase chuckled as she thought fondly of the beating they gave him that day. Issei slowly opened his eyes, and half anticipated to see a wooden sword coming his way, but thankfully didn't. He only saw the 2 girls in their lacy underwear. "What brought you here?" Murayama asked. "To grab an application," he answered shortly. Katase tilted her head to the side, while Murayama had a frown of confusion for a brief moment, before they flashed Issei a smile that could shine through the thickest shadow. "Really, you want to join the Kendo club?" When Issei nodded to their question, his hand was knocked from his nostrils as Murayama and Katase lunged forward to hug him. The air in Issei's lungs was knocked out from the unexpected contact. With Murayama's arms around his waist and Katase's around his neck, Issei took a breath in surprise only to feel that heat return throughout his body. The instincts pulsing through his body were nearly demanding that he pin them underneath his body, mark them as his, take them, spoil them, defile them. And Issei was more than a little frightened of what was going through his mind. "What the hell is happening to me?" D-Drag Elsha. The double set of laughter ringing in his mind was just a tad unsettling, but they quickly calmed down to answer. "You have 2 attractive, almost naked, sweaty girls attached to you. I'm rather impressed that you haven't given in to the urge. This is due to the dragon in you. Eyes, take a deep breath through your mouth, and not the nose." "And why does the sweaty part of all this make a difference?" Issei yelled out to Elsha as he took her advice and took a breath in through his mouth and blew out his nose. The implication of D-Drag's words sank in quickly, making Issei jerk himself back, half in surprise and half disgust with himself. He got his body free from the duo holding onto him and quickly pulled his hand back to his nose. They were their own person, made their own choices. Who was he to think that they were his? "Eyes, you're looking at it the wrong way," Elsha said, trying to soothe him. The girls looked at him with a mixture of hurt and confusion, until they saw that his eyes seemed to be unfocused. "Eyes, what's wrong?" Issei opened his mouth to speak, but the flash of green light in the room stopped him. It died down quickly, and all 3 of them were looking at his arm as he brought up the boosted gear. "Let me." Eyes, Elsha said to her pupil and successor. "Yui, Kaori, nothing is wrong per se. Eyes is just having trouble with his new dragon side, and the instinctual desires that come along with it. You know that he finds you both attractive. His new instincts are almost screaming at him to make a move on you too." The 2 girls were both surprised with the casual way the female voice called out to them, but figured that it was because she was linked to Eyes. An intense blush came over them with the mention of what was bothering the boy in front of them. "A dragon respects power and the pursuit for it," she continued, mirroring D-Drag's words. "With his affections for you too, your state of undress, and the sweaty post-workout state you're in, every instinct, both new and old, are going haywire." "Elsha, what the hell?" Issei yelled at the powerful woman. Line break. Walking home after school and after Sona had looked for something in his body, Issei had his phone out and was opening a new message. Much to his surprise, it was from his old buddy Matsuda. "Yo, Eyes, you free tomorrow? Motohama wants to go grab a new figure, and there's a new place we want to hit up." Looking up to the sky as he walked, Issei tried to recall if there were any plans he'd already made this weekend. He couldn't remember making any with katase or murayama, although there was something coming up that this little shopping excursion would be good for. He had only known Momo and Reya for a few days, so there weren't any plans there that he could recall. Sona had also said he would have his weekend to himself. Plus, he hadn't seen his middle school friends in over a month, so why not hang out and see what their new school life is like for them? The thought of being free to let his more carnal desires show was a welcomed one. I've got nothing planned, meet up at the same place and time. After hitting send, he pondered what he needed to look for tomorrow and how his friends would react. Buying a birthday gift for a girl could imply a closer relationship than what he had with them, but it would be so worth it to rub in the fact that he was friends with some drop-dead gorgeous girls now. Line break. Still sitting inside her office in the student council, Sona was going over what she found out about Issei's magical structure. She wanted to test for any possible elemental affinities that were lying dormant. There was a good chance that the servant would take on aspects of their master's magical abilities once the evil piece was placed inside them. All of her peerage had at least a small affinity with water after she reincarnated them, Tsubaki being the one with the highest so far. That wasn't too surprising, seeing as her family line was known for cleansing evil spirits, and water had purifying properties. But what she thought she found in Issei was just impossible. It shouldn't be possible, and to a certain degree, Sona felt that it was just wrong. As she expected when she first peered into his being, the greatest element he held was fire. Being turned part dragon would do that. The fire he displayed during her training session with Issei was nothing compared to the fire hidden inside him. It was a flame that burned unlike any she'd seen before. It was hotter than the flames Issei used previously, and it flicked wildly, almost as if trying to search for something to burn until not even ash remained. Then she found the small flow of water gently passing through him. That was a sight Sona had always found calming. It was a peculiar feeling for her this time though. She could hear the crackling of the fire, feel its warmth spread around her as she gazed at the crystal clear liquid. It gave her a sense of peace, a security she had only experienced from one other. That was when her mind's eye caught the small glimmer of something that looked like it was far in the distance, only to find that instead of being far away, it was just incredibly small. That didn't help the shock of what she found though, merely made her more curious about it. For something like this to have taken a place inside of Issei, it wasn't an inborn ability. Instead, it was something that he had to have regular contact with, something that his spirit, his soul welcomed into itself. Her own nature was telling her to run away from the small glowing globe, lest she cease to exist. It doesn't seem to be harming him in any way, at least, not with its current strength. How did he obtain it though? A person, an object? Sona was brought out of her thoughts by a knock on the door to her office. She straightened herself in her chair before calling to the person at the door. Enter. As the door opened, Sona knew who it was as soon as she caught a glimpse of that crimson hair. But why Reya was here to see her was a mystery. The Gremory heiress walked into the office with her usual grace and regal posture, approaching Sona's desk with a smile for her friend. Hello Sona, did I catch you at a bad time? Sona returned the smile. As long as the meeting was for a friendly nature and not something related to a problem in their territory, she was always glad to see the Crimson Ruined Princess. No, just finishing some paperwork is all. What can I do for you, Reya? Reya sat in the seat across from her friend's desk, legs crossed and hands folded in her lap, emitting the perfect picture of the noble birth from which she came. I have a request of sorts. Sona raised an eyebrow at that. Reya's almost never asked her for anything, and with the new addition to the Devil Count, there was little question in her mind that this request had to do with Issei. I'm listening. Line break. I swear you two are trying to kill me or something. Issei exclaimed through pants. After going through the usual evening with his parents, Drake and Elsha told him it was time for bed and training inside the boosted gear. Told, not asked. And for some reason that irritated him. His hands were on his knees as he bent forward, catching his breath. Once again he found himself in Elsha's field. This time around, they were working on getting Issei used to using his wings to direct his body to evade attacks. And after what seemed like days, but was more accurately just over 2 hours, he was sporting some good bruises on his body. Even if they were basically imaginary, they hurt like hell at the moment. Issei caught the sight of Elsha's white dress in front of him as her floral scent bombarded his senses. Her presence had an equal amount of calming and arousing effect on him, which felt really strange. If he ever told someone that he had been turned on by a woman that had been dead for over a century, he was sure they would give him a look of pure disgust, thinking he was some sort of necrophiliac or something. A soft hand cupped his chin and effortlessly lifted him back to a standing position. He was immediately met with the sky blue and green eyes of his predecessor. Her hand moved from his chin to back of his head. Elsha stepped forward into him, her left arm reaching around to his back and pulled him close into a hug. Her head leaned forward to rest against the side of his. I'm proud of you, Eyes. You're learning so quickly. She spoke softly into his ear. His newer instincts were flared from the close contact, as his face was being pressed into her bountiful bust. With a sigh of contentment and the quickly receding exhaustion, Issei wrapped his arms around to her back and returned the hug. His eyes were closed and taking in the floral scent Elsha exuded. He could now differentiate the separate flowers. Their night began with him and Elsha taking a walk and checking the floral species. Lilies, roses, iris, chrysanthemum, daisies. There were plenty more, but he couldn't identify those by scent alone yet. Let's take a break, okay, Elsa said as she released her grip on Issei. His grip tightened around her for a brief moment before pulling back to stand on his own. The two sat down in the shade of a tree to talk as Drake closed his eyes for a nap, not feeling that he was needed for whatever conversation was going on. Issei started to think about his day hanging out with his friends tomorrow, and what it was that he would be looking for. He'd have to bring the stash of money in his drawer with him. Eyes, Elsa said, bringing his attention over to her. Before we end for the night, there's one more thing I'd like for you to try. If a girl this unbelievably hot had said those words to him before he had met katase and murayama, Issei's mind would have gone straight to thinking of all the Yule things he'd want to do to her. Even though he knew this was pertaining to some part of his training, he couldn't help but briefly picture her naked, kneeling in front of him, her lips wrapped around his. Thud. Issei's head tilted back from being flicked between the eyes by Elsa. Rubbing the spot as he looked back towards her, he saw an amused smile on her face and her cheeks lightly pink. Focus. This is important. Elsa scolded him lightly. She saw the perverted grin on his face and needed him to focus. It was expected that his thoughts would wander that way due to his age and with his new change into part dragon, but that would have to wait until he was done with training. All right, I'm ready, Issei said after shaking his head clear of those thoughts. Elsa moved to sit directly in front of Issei and took both his hands in hers. What I'm going to show you is a stepping stone. We're going to do a form of astral projection. You'll only be able to hold it for a few seconds before coming back here, okay? Issei's eyes widened a bit at what she said they'd be doing. He wasn't really sure why she wanted to show this to him, but it sounded like an awesome ability to have. Line break. Issei was dressed and just about ready to head out the door, before remembering to grab the extra cash he had hidden away in case he ever needed it. Running up to his room, he pulled open his sock and underwear drawer and went directly to the bottom. Grabbing the bundle of boxers and lifting them up, Issei felt something metal in between his fingers. Pulling his hand back to see what it was, he pulled out a bracelet that was a mix of black and gold links. On each of the golden links was what looked like a small dragon etched perfectly into it, and on the black was a circular shield with unreadable runes. Issei's eyes widened as he remembered where he'd gotten this piece of jewelry. I can't believe it's been here this whole time. I thought I lost it, he whispered to himself. Sliding it over his left wrist, Issei saw that it was a perfect fit. It wasn't too tight and it didn't dangle too far off his wrist. Mr. Shido really wanted me to always wear this thing. When he grabbed the money from the other side of his drawer, Issei left his house to the train station to meet up with his friends. Line break. A quick train ride later, Issei was walking up to the cafe that him and his two friends usually met at for one of their city visits. The bell above the door rang as he pushed it open and walked inside. The mild chatter of the place was met with a scent that never failed to make his mouth water, his favorite food, cheesecake. Walking to the table where he saw the bald head of Matsuda, Issei took notice of the skimpy maid outfits that made this their designated fuel-up stop before they headed to wherever they had in mind. One of the maids in particular caught his attention. She looked like she would be a better fit on a runway as a model than working here. The short, low-cut bright pink and white outfit was straining to contain her ample cleavage and long-toned legs. Issei almost walked into a support beam in the walkway from not being able to tear his eyes away. Luckily, the voice of his friends calling for him pulled his attention just before he embarrassed himself. Eyes Matsuda and Motohama called out at the same time, seeing their friend staring at the same girl they had when they arrived. Issei took his seat at the four-seat table and greeted his friends. Hey guys, long time no see, he said with a light-hearted smile, genuinely happy to see them again. After ordering some food and small talk, Motohama stopped ogling the model waitress. So tell us, is Kyo Academy the promised land we dreamed it would be? Motohama asked, pushing his glasses back into place, making them gleam from the bright lights above. Issei immediately thought of all the top-notch beauties he's seen in only 1 week of being enrolled at the school, and his face split into a wide grin. You guys have no idea. There was a brief silence between the three before they yelled in anger and jealousy, and then smashed their fists into Issei's face, making his chair fall back onto the floor. Line break. Back in Kyo, Sona was pacing around the student council office, biting the nail of her thumb. Tsubaki had come in to assist with any last-minute duties that might have come up, and hadn't expected the scene she walked into. Never had she seen Sona look so worked up before, and couldn't even get a response from the Citri heiress. There were no ongoing problems that Tsubaki could think of that would bring this about, so it had to be something that came up this morning. But what is it, she thought? After a few dozen more laps around the room, Sona was suddenly stopped in place by a hand placed on each shoulder. Looking up from the floor, Sona saw that it was her queen and one of her best friends, and blew out a sigh to try and calm herself down. Haichu, what's got you so worked up? Tsubaki asked. Sona made herself sit down in her desk chair, the place she sat whenever she needed to think her problems through. With another sigh, Sona met Tsubaki's expectant gaze. But when she wanted the words to come, Sona felt a sudden lump in her throat and tears tried to make themselves to her eyes. I can't feel Issei. She tried her best to swallow the lump down, forcing her emotions under her control. It wasn't like her to lose control of herself, but she couldn't help it. The only reason she knew of for the link to her evil pieces to be cut was for the host to have been killed. She had just arrived at her office when her link to him was suddenly cut off. There was no spike to indicate that he was in trouble or pain, it was just gone. Like he vanished off the face of the earth. If Issei truly was dead, then it was more than likely her fault. She had been the one to reincarnate him, so if he unknowingly wandered into church or fallen territory, she honestly didn't want to think of what could have happened. The link went silent about 2 hours ago. I can't feel anything, no emotion, no sensation. Nothing. Tsubaki's eyes widened slightly at what she heard. Instead of losing herself to the same worry that her king was, she immediately tried to think of a solution. Have you contacted his family or his 2 friends? Sona shook her head no. I've been waiting to see if the link comes back. Tsubaki walked over to the file cabinet, looking for the Hayatu folder to get his home phone number, as well as the ones for his 2 friends Murayama and katase. Once she had them set on the desk, she paused as she reached for the phone. Do you want me to call in the others? Sona had her forehead resting against her interlaced fingers, and nodded. Line break. All in all, Issei thought the day with his friends was going well. He had successfully brought his friends into a jealous rage when they found out that he was pretty much surrounded by girls that could easily be future supermodels. And the look on their faces when he said he needed to buy a birthday present for one of them brought on more questions about said girl. When he said that Katase's birthday was the same weekend that she'd be staying over at his house, they had looks of pure murderous jealousy. They demanded to see pictures of the girl that he'd be in close proximity to overnight. He could feel the heat from their eyes when he showed the picture his mom took of them at the beach. It was a picture of him with both Murayama and katase. They were each in a bikini. Katase's was black and purple, while Murayama's was a bright yellow. Motohama took to scanning their sizes right away, and deemed that while Murayama had the greater assets overall, Katase's proportions were nearly in perfect balance, and therefore unable to determine which girl was better. His head nearly exploded from the indecision. When they were in the shop for Motohama to buy his Gundam figure, Issei struck up a conversation with a girl that had been buying the same one. At first she had seemed incredibly cold and serious when he approached her, but it hadn't fazed Issei in the slightest, having been shown the same treatment for years from basically the entirety of the female gender before high school. After he asked her about which ones would be a good starting place if he were looking to build his first figures, her pink eyes light up as she went into an excited rant about the intricacies of building and painting. Issei ended up buying 2 of the ones that the girl, Sikvera something or other, had recommended for beginning builders. They walked around the store talking about their mutual anime interests while Issei waited for Motohama to finish getting his supplies. She had asked Issei about his bracelet when he reached up to grab an instructional book of painting figures that she told him would be helpful in learning which pieces to start with. Issei noticed that Sikvera had a strange look in her eyes as she stared at it, almost like she recognized something on it. Once they left that shop, there was only one more place that they wanted to check out, the new gentleman goods store that had opened up. While they walked, Issei tried to talk to Elsha and Diedrag, both of which were either ignoring him or asleep still, which seemed odd with how late in the day it was becoming. Line break. Sona sat at her desk, with her peerage, and Katase and Murayama in the room with her. A map of the town on the desk with markers on points of interest. The group had gathered quickly after Tsubaki had called the Hayatu home to see if they knew where Issei was. Unfortunately, they had no idea what his plans for the day were, so they were all gathered to try and narrow down the possibilities of where he had gone. Momo and Reya were sitting next to each other, the concern clear on their faces. Yura and Tamawa had just left to check the shopping area of the town. Tsubaki was next to her king waiting for further orders. Katase and Murayama had been trying to call Issei's cell phone, which no matter how many times they called would go straight to voicemail. So it was either dead or had no signal wherever he was. Katase closed her phone and slumped onto the couch on the edge of the room, no longer able to hold it back. She started crying. Murayama was quickly by her side, rubbing her back, trying to hold herself together as best she could. She pulled Katase into a hug and stroked her hair to try and calm her friend down. Kaori, he's not dead, right? Katase asked in between sobs, as she had her arms wrapped around herself, leaning onto Murayama's shoulder. Murayama couldn't bring herself to even answer, afraid that she would lose control and start crying herself. They had checked all over town. No one had seen Issei at the spots that the Kendo girls said he liked to frequent. The sun would be setting soon, and if they didn't find or hear from him soon, Sona would have to make a decision. Either label him as dead or as a stray. Line break. Issei had just walked into his front yard and noticed that his phone had been turned off all day. Pressing the power button, he turned the handle and walked inside. Eyes. Issei was immediately pulled into the tightest hug he'd ever felt from his mother, her wet hands wrapping themselves around the back of his head. When the hug didn't let up after 10 seconds, he knew something was wrong. Pulling himself away from his mother, he looked her in the eyes. Mom, what's wrong? She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, the first dry thing that she could think of. After the student council had called, Mrs. Hayatu had called Katase to see if she had heard from her son. When Katase had said no, a huge spike of worry flooded her body. If the student council had been trying to get a hold of him, and wasn't able to, her first guess was that he was absorbed in something with his 2 girlfriends, as she liked to call them. Then she tried calling him herself, and when the 10th call hadn't gone through, she broke down, calling her husband to leave work and start searching the town, and know where he was. Safe and sound. Before she could answer her son about the fact that nearly all of his friends were looking for him, his phone started ringing in his hand. Looking at the screen, Issei saw that not only was there an incoming call but also 37 missed calls. He thought. Pressing the button to answer the call, Issei brought the phone to his ear. Hello. Inside of the student council office, Murayama took her phone out, deciding to give it one more shot. Katase's sobs had died down for the moment, giving her the personal space to reach into her bag and try calling Issei again. The screen lit up, and she clicked on the call icon, immediately seeing his number as the last one dialed. As well as the previous 8 calls. She felt the unease rise up again as she pressed the call button, expecting it to go directly to voicemail. Once she heard it ringing, meaning that it was actually connecting, a surge of emotion came through her. It must have shown on her face, based on the curious gazes from Momo and Reya. Sadness, worry, hope, anger. The emotions pulsed through her too quickly to properly tell which one was being felt at any particular time. As she heard the telltale click of someone answering the phone, the more prominent feeling was anger. How dare he keep them worried about him for hours on end? Hello, she heard Issei say weakly from the other end, and she just about exploded in rage. Murayama stood up from her seat, arm flinging out in rage as she yelled at the boy who had the nerve to make her worry so much. Eyes, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to get a hold of you for hours. As soon as Murayama stood up, Katase cast her tear-stricken gaze to her brunette friend, and her eyes nearly bulged out of her head once she heard her romantic interest's name. I was out with Matsuda and Motohama and forgot to turn my phone on. Did something happen? And now the situation made a little bit more sense to Murayama. Anytime that Ice had hung out with his 2 perv buddies, it was like they were off in their own little world of debauchery. A lot of people criticize the new generation for their dependence on cell phones, but those 3 would basically ignore the things when they were together. Well, that, and Ice could be quite an airhead when his mind is focused on something. Well, that explains the phone at least. The vice president said something about your link being cut off. We got worried when we couldn't find or get in contact with you. Murayama pinched the bridge of her nose, while the others simply stared at her. The devils in the room could hear what Eyes was saying thanks to their enhanced senses. Since Katase couldn't, she was the only one left not knowing the entirety of what was being said. She got the message that Eyes was fine, stiffly stood up, wiped the tear stains from her face and marched out the door. So that's what feels different. I appreciate you all being worried for me, but could you please not freak out my mom like that? She hasn't let go of me since I walked in the door. That was an image that made Murayama chuckle. She'd seen what a worried Mrs. Hayatu was like once before. After the chairwoman incident, her and Katase had been more aggressive in their daily training. When Issei walked in sporting a few nasty bruises, his mother had dropped dishes she was carrying and sprinted over to him and tried to smother him to death. At the time, Issei had been shocked still. Apparently that was the first time in years she had offered him anything other than admonishments for his ungentlemanly behavior or short and neutral conversation. Her and Katase watched from the doorway with a strange curiosity as Issei started to show tears on the corners of his eyes. When he slowly reached his arms around his mother and tightened, the two started to see the larger picture of who Issei Hayatu was. Right, sorry about that. We just thought maybe she knew where you were. And just a heads up, we're coming over, Yui already stormed out. So I hope you're ready. Murayama looked up to see Momo and Reya both looking towards Sona, a silent conversation seemingly being held. When Sona met the gaze of her bishops, she knew what they wanted, to go see Issei. She wanted to see him as well, and find out what was causing her to lose the connection through the evil pieces. When she gave a slight nod, the two bishops gave a bright smile and packed up their schoolwork. Shit mom, I need to hide this. Katase can't see it. Alright Kaori, I'll see you in a bit. Murayama rose an eyebrow at what she heard before the line went dead. What does he need to hide? And from Yui specifically, did he remember her birthday? Placing her phone back into her bag, Murayama turned towards Sona, who was placing the paperwork in a file to be dealt with later. Issei went out with his two friends from middle school, sounds like he just got home. Sona nodded towards the brunette, a small smile on her face at hearing that her new servant was safe and sound. That smile reversed as she pondered on just why she couldn't feel his presence anymore. She hadn't felt normal since the link was cut. Thank you. We'll be heading over there as well. I need to find out why I can't feel his pieces anymore. Smiles took over the face of the bishops and the Kendo user as they all made their way towards the Hayatu household. Line break. Finally getting his mother to release him from the death hug, he sprinted around the house, trying to find a spot where he could successfully hide the bag that held Katase's gift. He was a little worried that she wouldn't like it, but jewelry was pretty much out of the question. She wasn't much of a girly girl. So when he caught the smell of perfume that was almost an exact match to what he associated with his pink-haired friend, he felt this small bottle would suffice. His anxiety was rising as the minutes passed. Katase and Murayama had free rein when they came over, so the spots that he could hide the present were almost non-existent. It needed to stay hidden for another few weeks. Mom, where can I put this so they don't find it? Issei called out down the hallway to his mother. Mrs. Hayatu stepped into the hall, her index finger tapping her bottom lip in contemplation. A figurative light bulb went off above her head. Her head turned towards him as she pointed behind Issei. In my bedroom closet, there's a wooden chest on the floor with some family heirlooms. It should be safe in there. Issei thought about it for a moment, before shaking his head and walking towards his mother. Could you put it in there? Then I don't need to see something that might scar me for life. He raised his hand to give the bag to his mother, who at the moment had a disapproving look on her. One of Mrs. Hayatu's hands took the bag, while the other poked her son on the forehead. And just what does my deviant son think he'll find in there? With the almost non-existent distance between mother and son, Issei caught the scent of sugar and strawberry, probably from whatever she had been baking when he came home. I'd rather never find out just how far the apple falls from the tree, he said with a shake of his head, and walked towards the stairs to prepare for the incoming guests. Coming to sit in the living room, Issei's mind was going over his day and the differences he could now feel. Something didn't seem right. After waking up from being turned into a devil dragon, his sense of smell had seemed to be in overdrive. He had been bombarded with smells constantly for the last few days, but not today. He had gone through the day with Matsuda and Motohama just like any other outing he had previously. That may have been a blessing though. Going to such a crowded area might have been too much to handle at the moment. But that begged the question, why isn't he picking up scents from a distance anymore? He had only really noticed it when he could smell the sugar and fruit on his mother when she stepped close to him. While lost in thought, Issei didn't see his mother walk back towards the door, nor the multiple voices coming from the entryway. The quiet sound of a crowd of footsteps reached his ears, but didn't bring him back to the world. Is my body still adjusting? Is the sense not being registered by my brain completely yet? His eyes having a 1,000-yard stare, one hand scratched at the back of his head. The new arrivals came into the room unnoticed. Then there was the fact of his two mental residents. They hadn't so much as uttered a word to him all day, which hadn't happened since he became aware of them. Something was definitely wrong here. But that wouldn't explain why I can't feel the link to Kaichu anymore. What's going on? The couch he was on shifted from new weight. His mind was slowly peeling itself out of his own internal pondering, when a stinging sensation struck his left ear. Issei quickly shifted his head towards the direction of his pain, while grabbing his earlobe with one hand, and was met with the pink eyes of a clearly emotional Yui katase. The same phrase that ran through his mind when he saw all of the missed calls on his cell phone returned. Hello. Eyes that were still slightly shot from crying, cheeks tinted pink in either unreleased fury or she had smacked her cheeks a few times to collect herself. Katase had an air about her at the moment as her eyes locked onto his. It all but screamed that he needed to make amends for making her worry about him all day. Issei swallowed the nervous lump in his throat when his eye caught movement at the doorway. He had expected to see murayama and Katase after coming back from his little excursion. Possibly even Sona after the link being cut off had been mentioned. But no, here standing in his living room were 8 of some of the best-looking girls he'd ever come across. Katase sitting next to him on the couch, Murayama standing just behind her. Sona was sitting down in the love seat across from him, and the rest of her peerage, Tsubaki, Yura, Momo, Reya, and Tamo, all standing behind her. The brief thought of taking a picture of all of them gathered in his home, to use to rub in Matsuda and Motohama's faces, crossed his mind. The longer he thought about it, the more he liked the idea. Shifting his eyes over each of his guests, Issei gave what he hoped to be a disarming smile. His left raising in a slight wave, the light in the room caught the bracelet and made it shine for a brief moment. Evening, ladies. Issei could see Katase and Murayama both scowl at him, not amused in the least. His fellow devils, however, had a look of wariness, Momo and Reya especially. Sona and Tsubaki were the most composed. If you thought you were getting out of worrying us so easily, you've got another thing coming, Katase scolded, grabbing his attention. Murayama crossed her arms under her chest, nodding in agreement. Yay, seriously, Eyes, is it so hard to turn your phone on? Or you could have just let us know you were going to be out for the day? That way we at least wouldn't have wasted the day. During Murayama's tirade, Sona had gotten up from her seat and walked towards her pawn. Kneeling down in front of him, Katase and Murayama went silent and rose an eyebrow at the violet-eyed devil's action. Sona's hands hesitantly rose and grabbed Issei's left arm by the hand and forearm, carefully making sure not to touch the bracelet. Everyone watched as the Citriera's attention was solely on the black and gold jewelry as she took in every detail. Issei, her stoic, analytical, almost cold voice made him feel like he was a toddler caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Where did you get this? Suddenly nervous about answering his king, his voice wavered a little. The way she was looking between him and the bracelet, it was like she had just gained some clue to some mystery. It was a gift. My friend and her dad gave it to me years ago, just before they moved. He said it would keep me hidden from the monsters of the world, and I should never take it off. I found it in my room this morning. The urge to rub at the back of his head was almost too hard to ignore, with the nervous feeling he was getting. So, that's how it happened, Sona whispered, quiet enough that only Issei caught it. The hand she had on his forearm slowly moved to touch the bracelet, the slight shaking in her hand making it appear as if she were afraid to touch it. Her index finger came into contact with the cool metal, a small, almost imperceptible flinch came from the hand, but she didn't pull away. She ran her finger over it, testing the reaction. Then the rest of her fingers, ignoring the confused glances from Issei and the rest of the girls. Sona spun the bracelet around, finding the clasp, and took her other hand that was holding Issei's, and moved both to take the bracelet off. She paused to take a breath in, unsure of what was about to happen. As she unclipped the bracelet, Issei's mother was walking into the room. With her index finger and thumb of her right hand holding onto the bracelet as it slid off of his wrist, a slightly stronger surge of a dragon's presence flooded the room. Sona was somewhat prepared, and bit on the inside of her cheek to keep herself in check. The others, however, hadn't known what was going on, and thus unprepared for the flood that was released. Having been at a distance the last time this happened, katase and murayama were now up close and personal to the dragon energy Issei was emitting. Their eyes widened, hearts beat just a bit harder and quicker as a warm sensation permeated their bodies. To their normal human senses, it felt like they just sat in a comfortably hot pool of water, and that pool was swirling, trying to pull them closer to Issei. For the devils, it was a much more intimate feeling. It was as if the pinnacle of ecstasy had been raised several-fold. Never had any of them felt anything like it. When Issei had been reincarnated, it was potent. The strength they could feel in his presence was a bit stronger, but the intensity of the effect it had on them was greater than the last time. The only ones to keep their vocal cords from responding were, unsurprisingly, Sona and Tsubaki. But the pink dusted across their faces said that they felt it as well. Sona looked like her head was trying hard to spin from her link being reconnected, the feeling of a powerful undertow coming over her again. The most surprising and worrisome reaction came from the maternal figure of the one that they came to question. Mrs. Hayato had just walked across the threshold to the living room to bring some snacks for the friends of her beloved son, when it felt like her heart had swelled 4 times its normal size. A tingling sensation radiated from her heart to the rest of her body, followed by a loss of coordination and exhaustion. She dropped the tray, falling sideways to the floor, her head smacked against the hardwood floor beneath her. Seeing his mother collapse to the floor only a few feet from him, Issei ignored everything else in front of him, and shot out of the couch and nearly sent Sona on her back in surprise. "Mom." Issei slid on his knees, reaching his mother, and brought her into a half-sitting position, one hand on the back of her head, and the other around her waist, the only thing keeping her upright. With her body void of energy and head feeling heavy, Mrs. Hayato looked up with her dazed eyes, catching the worried look her son had. A lazy smile came to her lips as she rubbed the arm of her son that had wrapped around her waist to steady her. "I'm all right, eyes. Just a little tingly and tired." Her sentence trailed off as her eyes slowly closed, her head slumping forward towards her chest. Issei put a hand in front of her mouth, feeling for a breath. Then the hand went to her neck for a pulse. With both seeming to be somewhat normal, Issei gave a breath of relief. "She passed out," Issei said, not turning towards the girls in his house. Katase and Murayama were almost as tense as Issei was. Reason being, Mrs. Hayato had been like a perfect mother figure to both of them. She was kind, compassionate, empathetic, and more than willing to listen or help with any issues either of them had. She was the embodiment of what both of them lacked. They each walked over to the mother-son duo, Murayama kneeling next to Issei, rubbing his back to soothe his concern. Katase to ease her own worries of the mother figure unconscious in front of her. "Eyes, why don't you bring her up to bed?" Murayama's soft voice called out to him. He heard the words, subconsciously acknowledged them, but they didn't really sink in. Only the thoughts of making sure that the woman that gave birth to him was okay were in his head. He turned his body to the side as his arms caught his mother, one arm just under hers, the other scooped her up beneath the knees. Issei easily picked her up and started walking towards the stairs to place his mother into bed. Line break. With Issei out of sight, and presumably out of hearing range, it was Murayama that seemed the more upset of the human girls. Which has happened, her voice held a colder tone than she had used in a long time. Usually, it was Katase that was the aggressive one. But for someone she considered to be family, all bets were off. Sona had stood and watched in silence as the three had taken care of the older woman. There were no peace offerings to be had here. Nothing that she could say or do that would take away her actions. The humans, or recent humans in their presence, may not have understood what the possible ramifications were of what just happened, but the effects were felt all around. The fact that her pawn's mother had responded in such a way, however, that was odd, and definitely something to look into after all was said and done. Sona straightened her posture, locking eyes with Murayama. "I apologize for what my actions have caused, however unintentional. To potentially bring a normal human with no supernatural knowledge into harm's way was not my desire." Sona slightly bowed her head down, the most courtesy she felt she could stomach as a purebred, high-class devil speaking to a human. "I shall say the same to Issei when he returns. My thoughts have not been as clear and focused as they normally are, given today's events. And what I just saw, while it does not excuse my actions, it made me lose focus." Sona's response had cooed the Kendo girls a sufficient amount, but it had also raised a spark of curiosity throughout the entire group. They all saw the way that Sona had reacted to Issei's bracelet, heard his explanation of how he got it. But only now were they really thinking that the piece of jewelry may be more than it appeared. "And what exactly is it that you saw?" Katase murmured quietly, but loud enough for the supernaturally enhanced to easily pick up. Sona shifted her gaze to the pink-haired friend of her curious pawn. "Once Issei returns, we'll find out more." Her eyes gazing towards the bracelet in her hand as she spoke. Line break. Issei had just laid his mother down into her bed and covered her up with the blanket. The anxiety he felt had fallen a fair amount, enough to gather rational thought. It was only now that he realized that all his senses were back to where they were the day before. With the bedroom door closed, there was only a murmur of the voices from downstairs that his enhanced hearing picked up. His sense of smell had picked up the smell of strawberries, with an undertone of sugar and something else that he found relaxing. He was glad that things seemed to be returning to what was to be his normal state. And that was when his head felt like it would explode. Eyes finally, for a teenage boy living in the blooming age of technology, you sure are hard to reach. The voices of both Diedrag and Elsha caught him off guard. He hadn't heard them all day, so when they finally spoke up, it felt louder than it normally would. What the hell happened to you two? I tried talking to you, but you ignored me. Issei stated his retorts to them as he tucked his mother in and brushed her long brown locks out of her eyes. There was a brief silence between the three, Issei only waiting for a proper response from either Diedrag or Elsha. He didn't have to wait for long, fortunately. When we woke up, everything was hazy, only brief images and sounds would come through. It was almost like I was in the process of being awoken for the first time all over again. While Elsha was calm and deliberate with her words, Diedrag was more direct. The Welsh dragon's sentence struck a chord of similarity with Issei. Something had changed today that caused all of this, and thinking everything over, there was only one possible cause. The bracelet, he thought, which did nothing to clarify the situation. Issei rechecked his mother's position, hand once more brushing over her forehead. He had no medical training, but it just felt right to feel and see if she had spiked a fever. When she collapsed, he experienced an anxiety like never before. He wasn't entirely sure if it was from his new set of instincts, or just the familial love and care he held for her. Whatever it was, all he wanted at that point in time was to make sure that she was safe and healthy. With nothing else he felt he could do for the time being, he stood and started to walk back down to the girls. I think I know what caused it, but I'm not really sure how or why. Issei relayed to Diedrag and Elsha. Line break. Coming back down the stairs, Issei saw that all of his guests were seated. Murayama and katase were on the couch. Momo and Reya had somehow fit in with them. Sona was once again in the love seat, Tsubaki standing behind and slightly to the right. Tamo and Yura was sitting cross-legged on the floor on either side of the love seat. The atmosphere felt a little tense, whether the cause from the day in general or the events just prior was unknown. Coming down to the landing, Issei felt all eyes latch themselves onto him. He took a few more steps forward before stopping and set his gaze to Sona. Kaichu, I can feel our link again, can you? As the words reached her ears, that pleasant, warm sensation came over her again, reminding her that yes, she could feel her pawn. Outside of the nervous feeling he had, everything seemed fine. Yes, Issei, the link has been re-established. Sona adjusted the glasses from falling down too far, crossing one leg over the other. Before anything else, I wish to apologize, Issei. I meant no harm to your mother. Issei waved it off, knowing that she didn't mean for anything like that to happen. No worries, Kaichu, it was an accident, and Mom seems to be okay. Thank you. Now that the immediate issue has been resolved, I need to ask. Issei, do you have any idea what this bracelet is? Sona raised the hand holding onto the black and gold links. Issei shook his head. Other than what I said earlier, no. But now I'm guessing it's nothing ordinary, right? With the neutral look still on her face, Sona's eyes shifted over to the bracelet she was holding up. This bracelet is anything but ordinary, and the circumstances of it being given to you raises more questions than it gives answers. Sona placed the bracelet down on the armrest of the chair, resuming her explanation. I told you the story between the three factions and the heavenly dragons. But those two were not the only dragons to have come in contact with devils, angels, or fallen angels. With the Citri heiress going into lecture mode as her peerage called it, they all gave her their undivided attention. The tier below the heavenly dragons is the dragon kings, who hold power that rivals the leaders of each of the biblical factions. One of these dragon kings is Fafnir, the Gigantes dragon. As Issei intently listened, he could hear Elsha mumble quietly in his head. Ah, yes, that's what feels familiar. Ignoring her comment, he kept listening to Sona. Fafnir is said to be somewhat of a wanderer, collecting treasure and artifacts that catch his fancy. Legend has it that on one of Fafnir's outings, his presence had angered an Old Norse warrior, Siegfried. Siegfried was the wielder of the demonic sword Gram and managed to slay Fafnir. For one reason or another, the Norse gods revived him at a later date. Odin revived him in exchange for some gold jewelry to get his wife to forgive him for hitting on the Valkyries. Elsha's amused tone caught Issei off guard, and almost snorted trying to hold the laughter in. After his revival, Fafnir sought the help of the Norse and angels to create a piece of jewelry from his collection that could conceal his presence in a human form. They crafted a bracelet that would do just that. It was able to completely hide the dragon's presence to appear human. Sona placed the bracelet in her palm, staring at it as she switched gears. Tell me, Issei, how often did you wear this after it was given to you? The sudden question caught him off guard. His eyes shifted upwards with a hand on his chin as he thought about it, trying to recall the time after his friend had moved away. Well, I'm pretty sure I almost never took it off for the first year. After that, I put it on every once in a while, then lost track of it in middle school. Sona nodded meaningfully. On the couch, Momo's eyes widened as realization struck. So that's how that holy spark got there. All eyes turned towards the bishop. Everyone except Sona looked confused, but the king looked a bit put off that a member of her peerage had suspected a holy aspect and failed to inform her. He knew it was their Momo. Momo turned apologetic, tapping her index fingers together. Sorry, Kaichu. I felt it when Eyes was reincarnated, and thought the holy energy was what caused him all that pain. When Elsha said that wasn't the case, I thought that maybe I was just imagining things. Issei stepped forward with a hand raised. Kaichu, I'm a little confused. What holy spark? Turning from her bishop to her pawn, Sona gave her hypothesis. Because the bracelet was partly created by the angel faction, it was imbued with holy energy. I believe that, because of how long you wore it, that holy energy was absorbed into your body. When I tested your magic the other day, I saw it, but had no explanation as to why or how it was there. Issei scratched the back of his head with a confused look. Shouldn't that hurt me, since I'm a devil? Sona shook her head. If either energies had been forced into you, then they very well may have clashed and hurt you. But your soul welcomed each of them willingly. A brief silence overtook them before Tsubaki spoke. Kaichu, does this mean he will be able to harness that holy energy? I'm honestly not sure. The energy was solely for the purpose of protection and concealment, and it is an extremely small amount, therefore I believe harnessing it is unlikely. If anything, it may give him a slight tolerance towards holy objects. Issei stood next to the couch, taking in all the information, but had one burning question remaining. Kaichu, why did my mom react like that when you took off the bracelet? There was a notable uncomfortable feeling through a few of the devil girls. Only Momo squirmed a bit in her seat, while Sona and Tsubaki remained the same. That was the result of your dragon energy inside of you being suppressed, and then released all at once, Sona stated, switching which leg was crossed over the other, and entering lecture mode once again. Dragons have a unique trait to them that draws others, specifically from the opposite. The effect is felt more from those of supernatural origin due to our enhanced senses. Humans are able to feel it if the energy is strong enough, such as the release of when the bracelet was taken off. However, your mother's reaction could have been affected based on other factors. Sona took a moment to form the right words in her mind. The next part of her conversation could take a turn for the extremely uncomfortable very quickly. The feeling one experiences from being exposed to that energy is affected by how they feel towards the source. Think of it like a dam in a river that lets a small trickle flow through while in place. If the dam were to break, the flood of energy could have any number of responses. The other possibility is if your mother possesses a dragon tamer's trait, very little is known about the specifics of it. But it has been noted that those with it are more in tune with the dragon's energy. Issei mulled over the information given. There was a brief moment where his mind slipped into old habits. Katase and Murayama watched as Issei's face gained an unmistakably lecherous look, one that they knew all too well. Wait, so I can be like a supernatural babe magnet? That's awesome. I'm definitely going to work on using that trick. Haha. But Elsha was quick to rein him in. Eyes dear, women are good on picking up the intentions of men. It wouldn't work the way you're thinking if they suspected you're only trying to seduce them. What she's saying is that lust and love amplify the effects, especially women affiliated with the supernatural. Trust me on this. Love, well then that explains it. I mean, she's my mom, of course she loves me. Instead of clarifying what it was that Sona had been potentially implying, D-Drake opted to give his own opinion. Line break. The conversation afterwards had slimmed down. Sona briefly inquiring about Issei's training progress, and then into unimportant small talk. Issei had actually held a small conversation with Yura and Tamo, wanting to get to know them a bit, since they hadn't really had the opportunity yet. He found that he liked both of them. Yura was easy to talk to, very calm overall. She had a fondness for physical activity that made him want to ask her to train with him. Tamo had been the quietest of the peerage as far as he'd seen, but once he actually got to talk to her, she was by far the most energetic. It was almost like she had a switch to go from a loyal silent knight into a bouncing happy teenage girl. In Issei's opinion, it made no sense. He had forgotten to ask if his father had been notified that he was home now, so he called him. Based on the panic on the other end of the phone, he guessed that his dad hadn't been told. So he quickly made his way home. And once the paternal Hayato set foot in his home, he had to do a double take at what he saw. His son, the well-known pervert of the town who had been on the mend, was surrounded by girls, all of whom seemed to actually like his company. He couldn't be more proud at that moment. The sun had long set when the Citri peerage decided to head home, however reluctant the two bishops may have been, after hearing that the Kendo duo would stay over for the night. Line break. Elsha, why did the astral projection training suddenly seem so important? Issei sat cross-legged in front of Elsha in her garden. She had told him that other than training his fire, the astral projection would take precedence over everything else. Once he could project an image of himself and Elsha simultaneously for at least 5 minutes, then they would resume his regular training. But she never explained why. You don't want to learn it? She asked with a curious tilt of her head. Issei gave a defensive wave of his hands. I do. Elsha granted him a smile and held onto his hands with hers. As she closed her eyes, Issei interrupted the process of starting the projection. I'm just curious is all. It sounds like a cool thing to be able to do. But shouldn't I be training to help Kaichu and Reya's Gremory? Even with being spoken to, Elsha hadn't let go of his hands or opened her eyes. Instead, she initiated the astral projection. Issei felt a sense of brief vertigo, his vision darkening before seeing the setting of his bedroom come into view. He could see himself laying in bed, which felt really strange to be looking at himself. He looked down to his hands, which were fairly transparent and still being held by Elsha. Issei looked up to her to see that she was just as transparent as he was. Elsha was looking towards the door curiously, almost like she was waiting for something. The feeling of vertigo was slowly starting to build again, the outer rim of his vision slowly darkening. Just before he couldn't hold on to their projection anymore, he could have sworn he saw his door slowly creak open. His vision went completely dark for a brief moment, before he was back in Elsha's garden once again. As he opened his eyes again, he saw the smiling visage of his mentor. Her thumbs caressed a brief circle against the back of his own before letting go. I'd say that's a good improvement. You went from 5 seconds on your first try to 12. Issei frowned at the remark. It didn't sound like a good improvement when she wanted him to get to 5 minutes until they moved on. But doing over double the initial time with the dual astral projection was at least something. But it's nowhere near what I need to move on to the other training. Issei's self-deprecating statement had brought a rare sight to Elsha's beautiful face. A frown. Her right hand rose with her fingers straight and seemed to be tensed, as if to hold their position. Then her hand descended quickly onto the middle of his frontal lobe. The fact that you could even do it at all the first time was a miracle. Elsha scolded his self-loathing statement after delivering a chop to his head. Her blue and green eyes softened as they locked onto his. Her hands raised themselves to hold onto his cheeks. Her tone was soft and reassuring when he met her gaze. You've been thrust into a world of things you had never even thought existed. You've taken this all so well. Stop selling yourself short. I know it's hard for you to tell the difference, but you're almost twice as strong as you were when Sona reincarnated you. If you keep this pace up, with the training that is planned for you, that phoenix will kneel before you, and your friends and family will be safe once any potential enemies know it is you that protects them. Her tone was reassuring. If someone who was one of the strongest red dragons said that he was making good progress, then he'd take it at that. Besides, how was he supposed to really know how much progress someone should be able to make in a week? Elsha looked up for a brief moment, towards the sky, just like she had the first time they met. There was a quick look that crossed her face that Issei couldn't really name. But just as soon as it came, it quickly left. She gave her student her full attention once more. I wanted you to be proficient with astral projection because of the challenge presented to you, this rating game. The Red Dragon's destructive powers are something truly formidable. With training and practice, there will be few that can stand against you. But if you were to add the element of surprise as well, and that number dwindles down even further. Her serious tone quickly turned a mix of playful and mischievous. There's also a selfish one thrown in there too, but that one's a surprise for now. Line break. The last day of his weekend was spent in his now normal routine. A run in the morning, come back for breakfast with his parents. His father started to bombard Issei with questions about all the girls that had come over the night previous. Seemed to deflate when he heard that it was just the members of the student council from school. Issei decided that he would take it easy before returning to school, just relaxing around the house. There was something strange he noticed as he and his parents watched a movie together. His mother had lost that smell of strawberries and sugar when she had been baking before. That subtle smell of some sort of fruit he couldn't name was still there, just within the range of being able to be sensed by him. But the thing he found strange was the scent from his father, or the lack thereof. Issei had quickly come to relate the sense of the people around him with some aspect of their personality, a unique trait, or an ability. But his father was like the masses of his school, a scentless bar of soap, apparently being just as he appeared, a normal average guy. Line break. Issei would be eternally grateful that his life seemed to fall into a routine once again. Coming to Kyo Academy had brought so much change so quickly that he wondered if he could have kept up in class if it continued. It took some adjusting, but it was easy enough to get the swing of things. Wake up, run, breakfast, get to school, get attack hugged by Momo before class, lunch with Yui and Kaori, walk with Momo and Reya to the student council, check to see if Sona had anything for him to do, get the shit beat out of him at Kendo, dinner, training, repeat. The first alteration to this plan came from Sona. She felt that it was due time for Issei to get some on-the-job training of making a contract. The normal way for a devil to be summoned was usually through a magic transportation circle. But as Sona had explained after a failed attempt, Issei's body was lacking in demonic power. His strength came from his dragon side, so normal human transportation was his only way to get to the address. At least he was out of the room from Tomo laughing at his misfortune. The bike ride brought him to a small single-story house, the curtains closed and looking old and weathered. Laying his bike against the inside of the fence, Issei walked up to the door and rang the doorbell. In the late afternoon sun, Issei could see the curtains to his right shift slightly, the person inside peeking through to look for the visitor. A few moments later, the sound of multiple locks being undone on the inside latch of the door could be heard, and the door slowly creaked open. Open just enough to fit a head through. A young man in his early 20s with dark brown, almost black hair that was shaved down peeked through, dark blue eyes regarding Issei with caution. "Who are you? What do you want?" The timid voice of the man hadn't been what Issei was expecting, but answered politely. "Sorry I'm a bit late, but I couldn't use the normal flashy way to get here." The man looked at Issei speculatively before asking. "You're the devil." Issei chuckled and scratched at the back of his head. "One of many, but yay. And I'm here to grant your request for a suitable price." After a few moments of silence, the young man unlocked the door and led Issei into what appeared to be a kid's room and introduced himself as Hedwig. Whatever Issei had been expecting as his first contract job, this definitely wasn't it. All Hedwig wanted was to listen to music and play some games, and the device that Sona gave him to calculate the price had said all he would receive in the end of it was a comic book. Hedwig went as pale a ghost, and hesitantly went to the desk in his room, grabbed what appeared to be the only comic book in the place and held it out to Issei. 3 hours of repetitive techno music and 17 rounds in Soul Calibur later, Issei made his way out with his prize, and the pride of having completed his first contract. His ride back home was spent listening to D-Drag and Elsha say how weird the way he acted was. It was like Hedwig was mentally 9 years old or something. But Issei wasn't going to complain about such an easy job. Ready for this weekend, eyes? He glanced over his shoulder to see Tamo, the knight of his group, rocking from her heels to her toes. She and Yura had just walked into the student council office, where the rest of their group were hard at work preparing paperwork for upcoming school events. Class forms for what kind of display, booth, or type of entertainment they would each provide. It was a little monotonous, but once they had built a rhythm it was pretty easy to get everything sorted. I know I should probably be nervous, but I'm more excited than anything, he answered her with a smile. A flash of green on his left arm, the boosted gear appeared for seemingly no reason, other than for D-Drag to make himself known as the boosted gear manifested. Pretty much all movement stopped from the girls, all looking at the object that had a being with power they would likely never comprehend. D-Drag didn't speak much when in the presence of the Citri peerage, choosing to usually let Issei handle the situation. But every once in a while, he would, and this was the reaction for each of those times. Issei glanced at his arm for a moment, not stopping his task. Welcome for what, D-Drag? Nice of you to join us, by the way. Issei hummed in thought, as the way D-Drag worded that made a light bulb in his mind flip on. Issei had noticed a possessiveness to himself that had never been there before. It became noticeable when he saw some blonde idiot hitting on Murayama. It was obvious to everyone around, except the idiot himself, that she wanted nothing to do with him. His immediate thoughts were to march over there and melt his feet to the ground, then slowly peel back each inch of his skin. Oh, the joy Issei would get from teaching this moron to tread on what was his. It was a similar feeling to when he walked into a Kendo club as they were changing, only much, much stronger. Issei shook his head to clear the thoughts. I don't see myself ever getting used to that feeling, he said quietly, forgetting that the girls around him had supernatural hearing. She seemed quite pleased by how you handled the situation. Elsha brought herself into the conversation. When the feeling got to be too much to handle, Issei had walked over and reminded her about their plans for dinner at his place the week after the break. The blonde idiot muttered about how some guys have all the luck as he sulked his way off campus. Kaori had apparently wanted to complete the image and walked back arm in arm with him towards the Kendo club room. The side effects that he had been expecting were still there, and it seemed to turn into some sort of game between Momo and Reya. The main one was his lust and seeing how well he could control it. In the months since his reincarnation, in combination with his new hormones and instincts, he'd gone back and forth with keeping it under control. Instead of the few days of reacting on instinct like Elsha had thought, it had been a rather steady build. Issei was thankful for that, as it gave him time to adjust to the feeling. Their game started about 2 weeks ago, and Issei thought that Yui and Kaori were going to spontaneously combust with the rage they had emitted. Walking to school had been the same. The trio walked through the gates when Issei caught the scent of maple and wintergreen. An odd combination if this had anything to do with food. The scents were approaching quickly, and Issei had barely been able to turn to his left before Momo crashed into him. But unlike her usual glomps, where she would hug him tight enough to be on the border of human capabilities, this time she threw her arms around his neck and pulled herself up to give him a surprise. He would have thought it was accidental contact, if it weren't for the way her hand had moved to grab the back of his head, and the sultry smile after she pulled back. And once she had, Reya calmly stepped up to him, almost standing on his feet. She pulled the loose necktie that he'd decided to wear for once, since Sona was really strict about rules and appearances, and placed it of equal measure to Momo's. Ever since then, they would do that at least once a day, sometimes before classes started, or at lunch, or when he entered the student council. If they were trying to get him flustered and confused, it was working. D-Drag had warned Issei that Tannen had one of the hottest flames in existence before, but took a strange pleasure in the unease it brought to his host. Issei's face warped into a mix of anticipation of what he could accomplish this next week and concern over his physical being. Hopefully this former Dragon King wouldn't take things too far. I'm sure you'll come back to us much stronger. If you're hurt when you return, Reya and I can nurse you back to health, Momo said as she rubbed one hand on his back between his shoulder blades. He had never known that such a simple gesture on such a non-sensual part of his body could almost turn him into goo in her hands, but when she figured it out, Momo took advantage of it. Nurses, Issei mumbled, Momo's tender mercies making him lose focus and control. His mind picturing the two of them in Y-nurse outfits. Tight white blouses half unbuttoned, short skirts and the white cap. Momo, Reya, Tamo and Yura laughed as Sona rolled her eyes at her pawn. Issei, focus. Sona snapped her fingers in front of his eyes. His eyes refocused themselves from the glazed over look they'd held, and centering themselves on his king. Sorry Kaichu, he said, a hand rubbing the back of his head. She merely nodded before moving on. I'll be taking you to meet with Tannen tomorrow around 11 a.m. Be sure that you've packed sufficiently for the week. Issei snapped himself straight and held a salute to his king. "As you command, lady." Even though she rolled her eyes at him again, the small hint of a smile was enough to tell him that she wasn't upset by the gesture. She knew it was just him being his rather goofy self. "We're done here for the day. You're all dismissed. Report back Monday morning for distribution of the forms." Line break. "Eyes, you're heading out tomorrow, right, for that youth leader gathering?" His mother stopped him as he was about to head upstairs from the dinner table. Issei turned around and faced her from the kitchen doorway. "Kaichu is coming to pick me up around 11, and we'll head out then." His mother turned her head from washing the last few dishes towards her son. "Are any of the others on your student council going?" "No, just the two of us. The others either have other responsibilities, or just didn't feel it was for them." Mrs. Hayato nodded with a smile. "I see. I'm glad you got into that school. It seems to have done a world of good for you." "Me too, Mom. Well, I'm off to bed. Love you." His mother stood there, watching her son walk away. The changes over the last couple months had been a weight off her shoulders. But these last few weeks she started picking up on subtle things happening with her small family. She loved her son dearly, but up until he met those two girls that seemed to be glued to his side, she'd written off any good future for him due to his tendencies. He was calmer now, and actually thought about his actions. How he was managing that, she wasn't sure. Because the girls he seemed to surround himself with were all prime examples of how today's youth mature faster than all previous generations. Especially that red-headed one that came by when Issei was sick. When Issei was in middle school, he was distant from herself and her husband because they almost always got into an argument over his behavior. So a pleasant conversation was not something that happened very often, if at all. She hadn't heard him say that he loved her in far too long. She was so happy to have her son back. Not the lecture that the neighborhood placed secret bets on how long until he was on a Yule predator list, but the kind, caring boy he'd been before Irina left the country. Things were almost perfect, in her opinion. She had a loving, hard-working husband, and a son that was working towards what looked to be a great future. But there was one small hiccup that had come along, and she made a mental note to bring it up with her husband the next time it showed up. After her little fainting episode, Issei would now wish them a good night with a love you before heading to his room. After a week of that, her husband had started getting snippy with Issei. If Issei noticed it, he kept himself composed extraordinarily well. Because the third time it happened, she wanted to bite her husband's head off. All he'd done was praise her cooking, the same thing he had done not even 10 seconds before their son. "Don't talk with food in your mouth." It wasn't what he said. It was the angry tone that she didn't like. It was uncalled for. "No one talks to my baby like that without a damn good reason," she whispered to herself. Not even his father. Line break. Issei closed his notebook, finished with the last of his homework, and laid on his bed. He was thankful that Drake and Elsha were giving him the night off of the typical night training, since for the next week he'd be in a live fire situation. His mind wandered to the girls he was now friends with, and he had been very careful not to just say girlfriends, to avoid any sort of misunderstanding. Other than being a little more physical, there wasn't much that had changed between his relationship with Yui and Kaori, and that related to both their Kendo club practices and otherwise. After the in-game started for Momo and Reya, they felt the need to attach themselves to him in some way as they walked to school. He'd asked about their change in behavior the second day of it. After a brief glare from both of them, they simply said that he clearly needed a reminder of who his best friends were, referring to themselves and not Matsuda and Motohama. Other than the obvious physical attention from the two bishops, Issei had learned quite about them. Momo had a near-constant craving for ice cream, her favorite being mint chocolate chip. Her and Reya had taken to doing yoga together and had offered to show him their poses. She was also very fond of hugs, a fact he had already gathered. Her favorite color was orange. Reya cooked pancakes for herself almost every morning. Her favorite pastime when she was free was reading poetry. Her and Momo were living together in an apartment away from their families, under the guise of getting a scholarship to go to Kyoto. Blue was her favorite color. The only thing that Yura did on a regular schedule of her own was to watch UFC and work out. She lived with her grandmother the next town over and was talking to Sona about getting an apartment of her own, not wanting to keep watching her last living relative slowly slip away from her Huntington's disease. Issei was surprised to find out that Tamo had also lived in Kyoto all her life. She lived with her parents and an older brother in his mid-20s. She loved anything soft, fluffy, or squishy. He'd found out that around the time he had first seen her, she had gotten her first exposure to coffee. And caffeine ran straight through her. She had admitted all too readily that she had to pee 14 times that day and drank about 2 gallons of water. Tsubaki and Sona were still as much of a mystery to him as they had been since the beginning. All he knew about either of them was that Tsubaki came from a family that was renowned for dealing with evil spirits, and Sona was a high-class devil. If there was one thing that Issei wanted to change soon, it was his relationship with the king and queen, especially Sona. He handed his life to her, and was expected to serve her in whatever way she requested. Right, how was he supposed to do that when he knew nothing about her? Issei figured that by getting closer to Sona, he could learn more about Tsubaki as well, since they were rarely apart. Glancing over at his clock, Issei realized that it was almost midnight. He shifted under the blanket, ready for the first night's sleep without being dragged into his own consciousness to train. In the morning, he would have to pack for his week away. Line break. Of all the ways for supernatural beings to travel, a train was not one that would be on Issei's list of interdimensional vehicles. But he had only been a devil for a month. Just as she had said, Sona had rang his doorbell the moment the clock struck 11. There was a brief conversation about what they hoped to learn with his parents. Then the two teenagers had set on their way to the underworld. The train itself didn't look like anything out of the ordinary, and when Issei had said as much, Sona told him that was the point. They were in a human train station, and the public around them could see the train, as well as the two of them boarding it. She had also explained that there was a suggestion spell that kept humans from trying to board it. Issei, Sona called out, bringing her pawn's attention away from the swirl of iridescence outside the window. Yes, Kaichu. The pair sat across from each other in the middle car of the train. Her reasoning was that it was the front car of the train that the Gremory and Citri families shared. It wasn't that they couldn't afford their own train, but they just didn't see the need. The two families were good friends, and with the relatively low number of people that could or would use the train, requesting it was no problem at all. About your father, Sona started. Instantly Issei looked back out the window, trying to hide the way he felt about what had been happening. He had hoped that no one would notice, but Sona saw how Mr. Hayado was acting when she picked him up. She had done some research on dragons since she had basically recruited one. The pros and cons, things to expect and what not to do. See, I know. Alsha and Diedrag explained it to me. That explains a few things about my childhood at the very least. The first time his father had snapped at him, Issei was confused. He hadn't done anything wrong as far as he was aware. His two residents had explained what was going on, and it was just as stupid as it was strange. His father felt jealous about the newfound relationship between him and his mother. He felt that Issei, his own son, was a risk to his marriage. But Diedrag had quickly elaborated that it was a male's typical response to what he had become. To become aggressive, defensive, and territorial. I had always wondered why other boys my age would start off nice and then get all angry and aggressive with me. Turns out those rumors of kids being more susceptible to the supernatural are true. And my dormant sacred gear affected them just as much as my active one affects my dad. Other than staying quiet around him or avoiding him completely, I'm not sure what I can do about it. Sona kept her eyes locked onto the side of his head. She didn't need their connection through the evil pieces to know that this was hurting him. He told them how happy he was that his parents were proud of him again. And now this. But just like he'd said, there was really nothing that could be done to. The bracelet, she said, the epiphany coming to her from out of nowhere. Issei turned back to her, an eyebrow raised in confusion. The bracelet, she nodded. Under normal circumstances, Issei wouldn't have the means to negate the way that his father reacted to him. But it became all too apparent that Issei had come in contact with at least a few people that were aware of the supernatural. One of which had given him a priceless bracelet that would solve his problem, if only temporarily. It negates the effects and makes you appear completely human. If you were to wear it at home, then your father hopefully wouldn't react negatively towards you. The smile that came over her pawn's face could have blotted out the sun. The warmth that came from their connection almost made her think he was about to proclaim his undying love for her. Issei leapt from his seat, and in an instant her wrapped in his arms and was spinning around laughing. Sona's hands wrapped around his neck seemingly out of instinct, to keep herself from being flung into the wall or to the floor. Normally she would have never allowed such an action upon her person. But this wave of joy and relief she felt from Issei made her just want to enjoy the moment. It had been a long time since she felt anything like it, except from the obsessive antics from her sister. Sona was head and shoulders above him as he held her by the waist. When he stopped spinning, he planted his head onto her stomach and gave her an extra squeeze. Thank you, Kaichu, thank you so much. No matter how she felt about his abrupt actions, Sona was not accustomed to displays of affection. She had no problem smiling or laughing with her peerage, as few as those moments seemed to be. But hugs and ease had been beyond her almost since the start of her training to become the head of her family. A handshake was the most familiar she had gotten with anyone in a long time, so she settled for what she could handle. Instead of trying to hug him back, she merely patted him on the head. You're very welcome. She spoke kindly with a smile. Now put me down. And the heiress persona was back up. One more squeeze and Issei did just that. Both sets of feet planted back on the ground, they returned to their seats and Sona continued with the schedule for the next week. During the day, you will train with Tannen. I will be checking up on you occasionally once you've finished. We will also start on your knowledge of devil history and overall strategy. The rest of the train ride Sona gave Issei an overview of the underworld's history. Who controlled what, major cities, historic events, things that would at least give him an insight into what he would have to know if he wanted to ever be moved from low class. And his desire for a harem assured her that he would want that. It would also help her plan that she discussed with Reya's. Line break. Mountains. Outside of the window from the train flying through the air, at almost all Issei could see. The color of the rocks changed from brownish red to gray to a dark gray that was almost back. Sona's overview had ended once they heard that they were entering Tannen's territory. Issei had tried his best to stay on topic, but there were a few times that he found himself getting lost in those violet eyes of hers. He wasn't even sure himself what it was. Issei had a long-standing history of that only happening with him eyeing a girl's chest. He wasn't even sure what it was that drew him in. It wasn't the connection between them, as it happened the first time he saw her, before he was reincarnated. Those irises were so crystal clear, their color so vibrant. Sona seemed to notice every time it happened too, because she stopped talking for a few seconds to let him regain himself before continuing. Issei felt he learned a great deal from her. The highest-ranked families, of which Reya's was a descendant of, the Devil's Civil War, and the new leaders that became of it. The basics of how a raiding game worked. How demonic energy differed from any other pantheons. Those few hours during the ride flew by. The train landed itself, and the duo stepped out onto the grounds. Issei marveled at the height of the mountains before him. They seemed to go on forever. Their height was easily comparable to the highest mountain ranges in the human realm, and no matter how far left or right he looked, they were all he saw. There was little in terms of plant life here, but off in the distance, he did see a group of trees that seemed to be bearing some sort of fruit. Other than the landscape, the first thing that Issei noticed was the scent lingering in the air. Fire, frost, and if the tingling of his nose was anything to go by, electricity. Sona stood beside him as the beating of wings could be heard in the distance. The strokes seemed to be far apart, signifying a large creature was approaching. "Your instructor is right on time," she said, gazing off to the left. They both watched as a figure elevated itself above the mountains. At first, the size didn't seem substantial, just a purple blur in the distance. But as the beating of the wings continued, and Tannen drew closer, Issei saw just how wrong he was. Once the dragon was nearly directly above them, he covered almost all of Issei's vision. He was massive. The ground shook as his feet touched the ground. The blaze meteor dragon Tannen stood at 15 meters tall. Most of his skin, or scales, were a dark maroon, almost purple. His chest and abdomen were gray, and yellow horns protruded from the top sides of his skull, arching forward towards and in front of his face, just above eye level. "Welcome, Lady Citri," he greeted politely, a slight nod of his head to pay her due respect. Sona had informed Issei that Tannen was an ultimate-class devil, and had no need to pay such respects to those ranked below him, but he was known for his adherence to devil culture. The massive dragon turned to Issei and smirked. "You must be Issei Hayatu, D-Drag's wielder." Issei could only manage a stuttering nod. "I hope you're ready to get put through the ring of fire, hatchling." The remark had Issei's boiling for some unknown reason. Whether it was from anger or anticipation he couldn't figure out. But he knew that being compared to a baby was definitely insulting, that much he was certain of. Sona felt the connection between her and Issei start to bubble with an indignant rage, and couldn't stop him before he blurted his response out. "Just you wait, old man, I'll take whatever you can dish out. I'll show you, Elsha and D-Drag, that I'll be the best red dragon emperor the world has ever fucking seen." Sona blanched at how her pawn had acted, for both the disrespect and the profanity. This was not how she had been training him to act in front of someone of a high position. Tannen just threw his head back and laughed. His voice reverberated through the area and echoed off the mountains, not seeming at all miffed by the way he was spoken to. "Attaboy, will make you into a fine member of our kind yet. Ooh, this is gonna be fun." The legendary dragon set his eyes to Sona. "Don't worry about it, Lady Citri. I provoked him to see how far along his new body had taken hold. I guarantee that by the end of the week, he'll be stronger than your other peerage members, maybe even as strong as yourself." Sona looked between her pawn and the dragon towering over them, and was a little concerned at the identical grins they were sporting. She cleared her throat. "Thank you for the quick acceptance of my request. It is an honor to have a member of my peerage to have teacher of your caliber." Tannen waved off the compliment, knowing it was all for show, an aspect he liked the least of the devils he had decided to join. "No need for a show here, Lady Citri. I get it. For some reason or another, you need the boy at the top of his game as soon as possible. I would have accepted training the boy even if he wasn't a devil just for the prospect of training my first wielder of D-Drag." His statement was refreshing to Sona, who was so accustomed to maintaining a proper appearance with those older or higher ranked than yourself. She gave the dragon a small smile. "Yes, you're right. Reya and myself are grateful that you've accepted. I'm sure you'll enjoy watching his exploits in the next coming year." The scales that would have been an eyebrow rose. Then a knowing smirk came over him. "So that's what the plan is, eh? My lips are sealed. It will be most entertaining to watch that match." Sona gave Issei a look that he couldn't read. Expectation, worry, pride, it was far too complicated for him. "Yes, I'm sure it will. The debut of the millennia." Line break. Sona had parted from Issei and Tannen shortly after, and entered her office to clear up some last-minute paperwork. It didn't really need to be done now, but she liked to get things done ahead of time if she could. Leaving Issei there was harder than she'd expected. It felt like she was handing over a precious gem to a shady jeweler to refine and cut to be placed into a necklace. She preferred handling matters pertaining to her peerage herself, but this situation called for a different approach. She had been upfront about her intentions of recruiting Issei, of wanting him to help her open a raiding game school, her first step in changing the views of the underworld. Having someone of significant strength was a big must-have for that. She needed him to be at least stronger than half of the high-class devil population by the time it opened. She knew that eventually, she would come to care for him like she did for the rest of her peerage. She just hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. Was it the additional pieces? Was it his willingness to learn from them and to prove they could count on him? Was it the eagerness he showed in getting to know each of them? Was it that goofy smile? Sona wasn't sure if it was one aspect or all of them together, but Issei was quickly making himself to be an irreplaceable part of their group. If things continued at this pace, she wasn't sure she'd want to hand him over to Reya's at all, even if it were only for the month of her rating game. Their group just wouldn't feel the same. Those kind of thoughts were for later though, for right now, she had a promise to keep. Fingering through the student files, Sona quickly found what she was looking for, the 2 phone numbers of Issei's Kendo friends. Sona picked up the phone from her desk and dialed the one for Kaori Murayama. Issei had told her that the 2 of them would be together, and Murayama's would be the better bet for one of them answering. It rang once, twice, 3 times before it was picked up and answered by the now familiar voice. Hello. Sitting at her desk once more, Sona sat like she would if the girls were in front of her. It helped to keep up her strict student council persona in both image and voice. Hello, this is Vice President Shitori. She started, keeping to her alias. As you know, Issei Hayato is away for Golden Week. Before we parted ways, he asked me to deliver something to you and Yui Katase. The receiver of her phone gave off some noise of shuffling, a muffled voice in the background. Murayama had covered the phone to speak to the other girl in question, no doubt. All right, what is it that you have for us? I assume that you're aware with my group's particular methods of travel. Sona was referring to using a magic circle to travel to where a potential client held their flyer. We are. The girl's voice was flat and stoic. Sona couldn't particularly blame them for not coming around to the Devils of Kyo just yet, not after the introduction they'd had to her kind. Sona had pulled the 2 of them aside the day that Issei had awoken, and wanted to find out how they had come to know the existence of devils. The glares she received were just as telling as the actual words. Yui Katase was the daughter of one of the previous Kyo Warden's clients. Both of her parents frequently called upon Cleria Belil for various things. Her mother was killed by a stray that had picked up on the demonic presence lingering on her. Afterwards, her father was approached by the Gremory family to work on finding locations to expand the Kyo Academy brand, sending him away from his daughter. Kaori Murayama's parents both worked for a company that her own family owned, a pharmaceutical company specializing in terminal illness medications. The parents were sent to the main building in Sapporo, where the company had planned to move all but one branch, as a recent breakthrough required all hands on deck. The 2 girls had each found out separately, seeing the summoning of a devil from discrete spots in their respective homes, and only realized that the other knew based on finding the flyers in the other's home. Having your family's lives turned upside down was an adequate reason to discriminate against devils, Sona admitted. Issei wanted me to give each of you a flyer to use in case you were in danger while he was gone. I understand you may be reluctant to take them, but this was his request, and he was very adamant that you take them. Sona had to make sure that they knew this wasn't for her or any of the other devils in town. It was for their friend. There was a brief silence over the phone, as Sona assumed Murayama was contemplating what to do. They both knew that Issei's biggest priority was the safety of those close to him. Refusing the flyer would upset him. A sigh came through the speaker, and Sona knew she'd been able to keep her word. Fine, we'll come pick them up in an hour. Sona had to hand it to the Kendo duo. Their loyalty to Issei seemed absolute, and if he managed to get promoted to high class in a relatively short amount of time, he would have 2 very dedicated servants. And more than likely, lovers as well. Whether or not those 2 realized it, they were in love with her pawn. Her entire peerage saw it, except Issei it seemed. He had voiced his confusion over their anger from her bishop's physical signs of affection as of late. That is acceptable, I will meet you at the campus gates. Sona didn't bother with any more pleasantries or goodbyes, as the girls on the other side were more than likely to just hang up anyway. She heard the click just as she pulled the phone away from her ear. Sona opened a drawer in her desk, and just on top were the flyers with her family crest. She grabbed 2 of the flyers, setting them on her desk, and waited until the appropriate time to go to the campus gates. Line break. Issei had decided that Tannen was as much a sick sadistic trainer as he was a big purple dragon. They had come into a clearing over a mile long and 2 miles wide, and the first thing Tannen did was tell Issei to carry a small white dragon on his back and run the perimeter of the clearing 25 times. The dragon on his back hadn't spoken at all, and just hopped onto him as ordered. It was apparently a lightning dragon, because if Issei slowed to a point that was deemed unacceptable, it gave him a very painful shock. Issei had made it 5 laps before almost calling it quits. That was when Tannen had explained just how Issei would get so much stronger so quickly. He wanted Issei to boost twice and transfer the power to his legs, and then once for the mass for the dragon. Tannen had said that while the boosts would help, it would still be his muscles doing the work, and the added strain would help to increase both strength in his legs and stamina. There was also the benefit of his body becoming accustomed to the power the boosted gear would send through him. Shit piss fuck cunder motherfucker. Issei ranted this stream of curse words in his mind repeatedly as the burn intensified. He was currently on his 21st lap, and had no idea how he could still be standing on his own 2 feet, let alone carrying a dragon that weighed who knows what at this point. The weight got easier for a brief moment, but Issei intimately knew what was coming next. Apparently, he could boost almost indefinitely as long as the amount power sitting in his body didn't become too much. This batch went to his legs, and his breathing became just a tad easier as he prepared for the next addition to the weight of his hitchhiker. Issei slowed down to barely a jog when the weight changed once again. As painful as this was, Issei had to admit it felt effective. He would be refreshed before a new layer of difficulty was added. Come on, hatching 2 more laps to go, Tannen called out from the sky, where he was following his pupil. Issei restarted the string of curses in his mind as he did his best to pick up the pace. He was so ready for this to end for the day. Shit, piss, fuck, cunder, motherfucker. He thought the words so much, they developed a rhythm that almost resembled a tune to a song. He pushed with what little energy he had left. He came around the bend to mark the last quarter of the second to last lap. The white dragon on his back shifted the position of its tail only a few inches to the left, but it was enough to get caught in between Issei's legs. His left leg pushed forward, catching the tail with the top of his foot, causing them both to tumble over each other over and over. When they finally came to a stop, Issei's head was spinning from the unexpected change in movement. A loud thud and the tremble in the ground alerted him to his trainer landing somewhere in front of him. He couldn't tell the distance due to his swirling vision. A valiant effort, hatchling. I half expected you to call it quits around the 10th lap, but you're giving it everything you've got. Handsome, you can head home. The white dragon nodded its head, extended the wings that had been flat against its back, and flew off. Issei stood up, his legs unsteady due to still being dizzy. He held one hand to his temple to try and stop the world from spinning. So, old man, are we done for the day? Issei asked once he could look in the same spot for more than a single second. Haha, absolutely not, you hatchling, or a dragon. As such, you should know that you'll recover enough to move on to more upper body exercises in about an hour. And that's about the length of time it'll take for you to jog there. Issei groaned. He was hoping to get into something exciting, like improving his fire or other techniques. He fully understood the importance of having a well-trained body, but it didn't make him like what he was being put through so far. Alright then, where to? Tannen lifted a clawed hand to point between 2 larger mountains, a pathway visible between them. Through that passage is the Valley of Dragon Mountain. Once you make it there, you'll find a tree bearing dragon apples. You'll wait there until your sparring partner arrives. Dragon apples, he'd never heard of such a thing, but then again, he was in the underworld, a place he never really considered existed in the first place. D-Drake hadn't manifested the boosted gear this time, instead just the green glow on the back of Issei's hand appeared when he spoke, right where the gem on the gauntlet would usually be. What do they taste like? Issei asked as he started a slow jog towards the place Tannen had indicated. Perhaps if the harvest has been sufficient, Tannen will allow you to have one. There was a gold shimmer in Issei's line of sight. It looked like golden dust particles were gathering together. It was strange how the golden things seemed to be moving with Issei, staying in the same spot in his vision as he moved forward. What the hell is that? Was he exhausted enough to be hallucinating? It didn't feel that bad. In fact, Issei was recovering his strength just like Tannen had said. One moment, came Elsha's voice again. The gold shimmer started to get denser, but still somewhat transparent. It was beginning to look like an outline of a body. The legs were long and slender, coming up well-rounded hips and a thin waist. As the form came up to the chest, Issei finally noticed what was missing. Clothes. Well-rounded S led up to the blonde-haired and mixed-eyed face of Elsha, who was smiling triumphantly. Ah, much better. She looked at Issei's face, which was wide-eyed and open-mouthed as he stared at her while still jogging. What's the matter, eyes? Elsha asked with her head tilted to the left, a strand of her hair slipping from her ear and over her shoulder. Are you two conspiring with the girls to test my self-control? Because this will be torture if you are. D-Drake's voice was flat as he watched through his host's eyes. What are you talking about? Issei closed his eyes for a brief second to take a calming breath. The shaking of his movement made him open his eyes almost right away to force the uncoordinated feeling away. Okay, one, how did you do that? And two, you're naked. Elsha's eye widened and she peered down to her projected body and saw the lack of clothing. She wasn't bothered by it, as nudity hadn't been a big concern during her time. Yes, I am. Does my naked body bother you? You sought to gaze at naked girls frequently in middle school. Issei was trying really hard to keep his eyes on where he was going and not on her body. But his control was slipping, spending just as much time looking at her as he was the path he was following. Bother me no way, you're easily the hottest naked girl I've ever seen. But it is very distracting. He wasn't sure if he could even touch her, but if she either didn't put clothes on, or stop what he could only assume was some form of astral projection, he knew without a doubt he'd try. I see. Elsha tapped her chin in thought. The way her arms were against her chest only made them more pronounced. After you're done for the day, we'll try this again. Maybe after some rest, my clothes will manifest as well. Her image became more transparent before shimmering away completely. Line break. Issei laid his head against the long log beside the fire he'd started, staring up into the strange purple sky. I left on Saturday, so that would make today Friday, he asked himself. As tiring as the training was, it made the days go by in a flash. Issei found himself losing track of how long he'd been out here and how much longer he had left. Hey, it's Friday. Tannen had left a while ago, leaving Issei to his own devices. Or more accurately, to leave him at the mercy of the Norsifier dragon and D-Drake. Today had been more of what Issei had been looking forward to during this training period. He was sparring against a blizzard dragon named Rake. Tannen had explained that while at a glance his own fire would put him at an advantage, blizzard dragons were able to manipulate that ice. So if the area they fought in became covered in the frost, he could easily be taken down. Issei had been hard-pressed to physically overpower the dragon. After being nearly ripped apart by the ice shards around the field, Issei jumped out of the way and towards the edge of the battlefield, setting most of the ground on fire to melt all the ice around them. It ended in a stalemate when both of them sank down to the ground, breathless. Issei held up the fruit that Tannen had been growing on his territory, the dragon apple, a darker shade of red than apples in the human world, a bit larger too. But the taste was nothing like he could describe, just like Dreg had said. It was juicy, sweet, and a bit tangy. It was also now Issei's favorite fruit. Until he'd taken a bite of it, he had a hard time believing that one of these fruits was able to sustain a fully grown dragon, unless they ate all that the tree had growing on it. Whatever these things did to dragons was amazing. They were filling, able to quell the hunger built from the harsh training, and it helped soothe his aching muscles. There was one other mystery solved now that he'd held the fruit. The nameless scent that Issei had picked up from his mother was sitting here in his hand. The thought made him feel a little homesick. Well, maybe homesick wasn't the right word, but he was concerned for her safety since he wasn't there. And overall, he just missed her. The lunches she made him for school, the way her hugs just made him feel totally accepted and loved, her calming presence. Damn it, stupid dragon tamer traits. It's making me sound like sniffling 5-year-old. He grumbled to himself. A gold shimmer of light that had become all too familiar during this week caught his attention. And the still naked Elsha walked over and laid down next to Issei. You know that you can't help but eyes. It's how the dragon tamer's ability works. You've heard those old stories about a dragon guarding a young woman in a tower that's usually a dragon tamer being guarded by the one she connects with. Over the years, the true accounts have been bastardized to ignore the fact that the savior was trying to kidnap her in the first place. Issei turned his head to look at her, trying his best to look her in the eyes and not gaze at her spectacular body. Are all dragon tamers female? Elsha nodded, noticing the way that his eyes kept wanting to shift to her chest. He was doing a good job of it tonight. Yes, to my knowledge, there has never been a male dragon tamer. Issei thought about a male dragon tamer having the same effect on him that his mother did. The thought made him cringe and shiver. For the sake of my sanity, I hope I never prove that statement wrong. Issei sat up and finally allowed himself to look over Elsha's body. If there were ever a model image of European beauty, she would definitely been in the running for it. You still haven't answered me on how I can see you or why you're naked. He felt himself get a little hot under the collar when she sat up and stretched with her hands over her head. Your astral projection training has progressed enough to where I can manifest like this with little to no strain on you. I imagine that in another month or so, you'll be able to feel me touching you, as well as have others see me. I could form my clothes, but that would significantly shorten the length I can stay like this, and I am enjoying spending time with you this way. Issei had to use his hand to cover her body from the shoulders down from his eyesight. So you're basically a ghost when using the projection. Precisely. Elsha nodded with a bright smile. You spent a few hours out like this the other night. So why did you set the goal for me to reach 5 minutes before? Because while we are in the boosted gear, astral projection is more difficult. You have to bring your mind and part of your soul back into your body and then redirect it outward. It was a quick way to get your ability up to par. Plus I had you project both of us, thus adding to the difficulty. Issei was starting to get near the end of what he'd be able to comprehend on this subject, so he asked what he felt were the important aspects of this magic. Alright, how long are you able to stay in this ghost form, and can I see the same way I could when it was activated from the sacred gear? In this transparent form, about 8 hours. If we tried a fully visible, spiritually tangible body, about 4 minutes. And yes, you can see the same way even if you're conscious. Line break. Issei had been trying to fall asleep for the last 30 minutes now, the smoldering campfire to the side of him still radiating enough warmth. After his talk with Elsha, he wanted to try and use the astral projection for a few minutes. He was glad to see that she was telling the truth, that it was easier. The image was also a lot cleaner. Before there was always this bluish-gray hue to everything, but this time it was crystal clear. Once he'd stopped and wanted to get some shut-eye to be well rested for the next day of training, his second to last day here, his mind was racing with the possible uses of his new skill. Checking an area with possible enemies without the need to send a person in to scout. He could have Elsha watch behind him to prevent a sneak attack. Distract someone when they saw her and make them look the other way. If he'd had this ability a year ago, he'd only have used it to peek on the girls. The idea sounded tempting, but the backlash probably wouldn't be worth the trouble. Plus Elsha seemed to have no problem being naked around him, so he could get his naked flesh viewing quota filled almost whenever or wherever. It still made him want to touch though. His thoughts were finally calming down enough to where he'd be able to fall asleep. With his eyes closed, his hearing and sense of smell felt amplified, even though he knew that wasn't true. The smell of burning wood was most prominent, and behind it he could catch the sense of the forest that the breeze carried over to him. The embers of his fire crackled as the moisture evaporated from the wood. Issei found the sound comforting, like for those who keep a fan on just for the white noise to fall asleep to. A different sound came from off in the distance, almost like a crunch of a foot on the softer dirt over by the tree line. He ignored it for the time being, choosing to listen to the strange birds quietly chirping from above and behind him. He heard it again, that crunch, but it was closer this time. Issei could tell that it definitely a foot this time. Trying to appear as though he was asleep, he weighed his options of what to do. He could call out to the person, hoping they'd respond. He just open his eyes, get up and look. Or he could project himself to keep his facade of being asleep in place. This is a good chance to practice the projection eyes. Use it and watch whoever is approaching. Elsha spoke in his mind. Diedrag must have already fallen asleep, but if things got physical he was sure to wake up. Issei concentrated on himself, the same way he did in the boosted gear. Elsha had described the process as tying a tether from the soul to the body and letting the soul fly freely. He felt the spot that was warmer, then the rest of his body and grabbed onto it, picturing himself casting it out like a fishing line. His vision went from pitch black to watching the campfire from above, his body at rest beside it. Looking at his own body, he could already see the difference that these last few days had made. He wasn't the scrawny guy he was before getting into Kyo. Most of the additional muscle was just from the transition into being part dragon, but his training had definitely added some definition. Issei turned to where he thought the footsteps were coming from. Outside of the ring where his campsite was, there was no light to see from. Even with his enhanced night vision, he couldn't pick up any movement. Whoever or whatever was approaching him had yet to move since the last crunch he heard. All he could see was the silhouette of trees and the few bushes surrounding him. Another crunch. Issei spun around, trying to see what had changed positions. But nothing seemed different. Damn, where are you? That last step was definitely closer. But his new sense of hearing was still something he was getting used to, and wasn't able to even guess at how far the sound may have come from. 3 more steps. Issei thought he saw something, but the breeze that came through had made the trees and bushes all sway as well. So again, no luck. If they got any closer, he'd probably have to stop the projection to get ready to protect himself. Issei couldn't think of any positive reason why someone would be sneaking up on him in the middle of the night. The wind picked up again, and Issei looked to his right. The scent he picked up was somewhat familiar, but also held a significant difference as well. Water. It smelled like a fresh rain had just finished, the refreshing scent that his king carried. The difference in it was hard to explain. It was like he could smell the cold in it, so instead of a fresh rainfall, it was more like the waters running off of a glacier. Crisp, crystal clear, refreshing, and very, very cold. Issei spared a glance at his body and oriented himself to where the scent came from. 45 degrees from the left side of the log. He ended the projection, returning to his body. Issei opened his eyes and stood up quickly, turning toward the direction the cold scent came from. There were 2 trees, a bush, and something that looked like it had short vines or hanging branches close to the ground. There was a flash of blue from the unknown thing that Issei had assumed was some sort of weird underworld plant. A pointed projectile came towards his left knee, almost too fast for him to see. But it was still too fast for him to dodge. It collided with his thigh just above the kneecap, and ice started to form around his leg. Shit, this week was making Issei really start to dislike dealing with ice magic users. He took a medium-sized breath, ready to melt his leg free. His head pointed down to his freezing leg and spewed a small but hot flame. A 2-second burst was enough to get himself free. Issei brought his head back up, only to see another flash of blue, this one looking like it was aiming at his chest. He jumped to the right, getting out of the circle around his camp and into the clearing. Issei activated the boosted gear, ready to strike back against his assailant as a larger ice projectile flew by. He could feel Diedrag stirring as the gauntlet covered his arm to the elbow. Issei didn't look at the gem, but asked Diedrag as he kept an eye on his opponent. What begins? Issei started to draw upon the energy in his body, pulling it towards his arm with the boosted gear. Great, he mumbled as a red ball formed in his palm. Issei drew his arm back quickly and shot it forward towards the figure still covered in darkness. Dragon shot. The baseball-sized collection of energy expanded once it was let loose. 10 feet wide and 7 feet tall, the red beam shot towards its target. The bright light made Issei squint his eyes, and thus missed the figure stepping to the side before vanishing. As the red light faded, Issei saw the destruction that one shot had dealt to the line of fire. A large ditch followed the path, along with trees that had been singed in half or completely blown away, leaving only the roots behind. Holy shit, that attack might not do anything against Old Man Tannen, but it sure as hell is a good landscaping trick. Without the trees or other brush in the way, the moon lit the ground at least a little. The figure that had attacked him was nowhere to be seen. He scanned to the left and right, but saw nothing but the usual forestry. Issei was slowly turning when he caught that cold scent again. This time, it was very close. He spun around quickly and was surprised to see a rather short and well-endowed girl wearing a costume he recognized from a show that Motohama made him watch. His surprise was all the girl needed to get her shot in. She had a pink wand that was almost as tall as she was, with a gold star in the circle at the top of it, raised above her head. She spun it twice, star-shaped sparkles shooting off, then slammed it to the ground. Celsius cross trigger. The entire clearing was shrouded in a layer of ice that appeared from nowhere. Issei felt it slam against him and cover him up to his elbows. He was trapped. I hate ice. He tried moving any of his limbs, but they wouldn't budge any, and he wasn't sure that even if he boosted he'd be able to get this thick layer off of him. The girl in the magical girl costume stepped forward, each step making her short pink skirt come dangerously close to revealing what lay underneath as her S jiggled side to side. She came within 10 feet of him and puffed her cheeks as she pouted at him. The pink skirt was accompanied by a pink button blouse that exposed her navel, a size too small thanks to the size of her S. He blurted out his thoughts before he could stop himself, his training making the dragon more prevalent in him, and the filter for his mouth almost non-existent. I never thought I'd meet a girl cosplaying Magical Girl Milky Spiral 7 that could actually do magic. He'd slap his hand over his mouth if he could, but the ice certainly prevented that. He noticed the girl in front of him stop mid-step, her somewhat familiar violet eyes widening before a broad smile came over her. The girl bounced over to him happily, humming a tune he'd never heard. Still the same energetic girl, bless her heart. He heard Elsa whisper. Her happy face turned into a pout once they were nearly face to face, her puffed cheeks making her look far too innocent to be a girl that had literally frozen him to the ground with seemingly little effort. It was mean of you to attack me. You almost broke my wand. She stepped back and crossed her arms under her chest. What do you have to say for yourself? Dumbfounded by the rapid-fire changes she was showing, Issei scrambled for the first logical response he could come up with. You shot first. The girl started tapping her foot, clearly wanting more of an answer than that. Her ass were once again jiggling from the movement of her leg, and Issei was finding it hard to further explain himself, rather than stare at her. With a face that was almost identical to Sona, a larger and bouncing bust, plus the outfit, his mind couldn't bring up anything other than X-rated thoughts. Could you stop that please? It's really distracting. This week had really done a number on his self-control. With Elsa it seemed fine, because he knew that he couldn't touch her, so that took away part of the urge he might have felt otherwise. But this girl was flesh and tannin seemed to both fuel and encourage Issei giving in to what the dragon instincts were craving for. The two ideologies had been waging a war this whole week. She stopped. Issei wanted to crawl away from the sad puppy look she sent him. You don't think I'm attractive? Don't say a word. She's playing with you. Elsa spoke aloud, the ice surrounding his sacred gear making the sound echo up through the ice and straight to his ears. Elsa, you ruined my fun. The girl whined. I think you've had enough fun already, Seraphal. I don't think your sister would like getting her pawn back with half of his body covered in frostbite. Dragon or not, ice at absolute zero is dangerous. Seraphal shivered as she thought about the glare that Sona would give her. Yes, it is, came a familiar stoic voice, a blue magic circle appearing just behind Seraphal, who had stiffened. The circle flashed and revealed Sona, rubbing the bridge of her nose. She should have expected something like this to happen, especially given the conversation she just had with her family. They had initially been confused when Sona brought the topic of marriage up herself, and then appalled at the mention of training her pawn to be the one to be her husband. It was only after everything had been laid out that they were even willing to listen to her plans. Sona, I missed you. Seraphal launched herself at Sona, grabbing onto her around the neck, nuzzling their cheeks together. You saw me not even an hour ago. Her voice conveyed her annoyance as she tried to pry the amorous Satan off of her. Once Seraphal was back on her feet, her happy expression turned serious. She glanced back and forth between her captured opponent and her sister. You're sure this is what you want, Sona? Sona pushed her glasses back into place, having fallen down from her sister's actions. He is the best candidate I've found by far. Sona stepped away from her sister and towards Issei, looking as he had started to shiver. Good evening, Eyes. I apologize for not checking on you like I said I would. There were some family issues I had to deal with at the last minute. Issei clenched his teeth, trying to keep himself from displaying just how cold he really was. He missed that this was one of the few times she called him by his nickname. Hi Kaichu, no worries, but if you could get the jailbait over there to let me out, I'd really appreciate it. Both girls looked at him with their mouths agape. Sona couldn't believe what a member of her peerage had just said about one of their leaders, her own sister no less. Seraphal, while shocked, was happy with being described in such a way. Most of the underworld had a general idea of how old she was, and a girl likes knowing she's not looking her age, even if she could alter it with magic. You'll have to excuse him. Tannin has been reinforcing the dragon instincts to get better training results. He'll be back to normal a few days after he's back home. It took a few moments before either of the girls moved, and Seraphal was the first to recover. She burst out laughing, holding her stomach and trying to remain upright. He'd won the Devil King of Foreign Affairs over. He knew what her outfit was from. 1 month after being reincarnated, and he was already at a low-leveled high-class devil's power, and he didn't capable of lying or hiding his true intentions. Yes, he would be a welcome member of her family. Her sister was going to have one powerhouse of a pawn, given enough time. She would make sure that he moved up quickly. What brings you here? Kaichu Issei ignored his king's relative, in favor of finding out why she was here so late at night. Yes, Tannin has been called away for the time being, so your training has been cut short. He sends his regards, and offers another training session at the time of your choosing, so long as schedules are in agreement. A large shiver ran over Issei. The cold was really starting to affect him. I see. Kinda bummed it's getting cut short, but I understand he's got more important things to do. Another shiver, this one even larger than the last came. Kaichu, can I get out of here now? This ice is dousing my fire, or I'd do it myself. Sona sent a glare to her sister, who was wiping a tear from her eye, still giggling. Yes, I believe my sister was just about to release you. Sona was not an ice user, but the look she gave Seraphal made her 460-degree ice seem like a warm summer's day. Eep on it. Seraphal hurried to where her wand was laying on the ground. Once she had it, she waved and the ice shattered from his body. He shook the remnants from his frame. Since the gauntlet was still active, he gave himself a little jump start to warm himself up. The quick temperature change made his fingers and toes a little tingly, but he was fine other than that. He made his way over to Sarah Fall, who he had yet to be introduced to. He gave the short woman a bow. As you know, my name is Issei Lady Sona Citrus Pawn. Sarah Fall gave the boy a broad smile. Hey there, I'm the Devil King, Sarah Fall Leviathan, your master is my little sister, welcome to the family. Issei blanched. He had unknowingly been belittling one of the 4 leaders of the underworld. Kaichu is so gonna be pissed when we get back to Kyo. Well, at least someone found his situation funny. If it wasn't his ass on the line, he probably would too. Eyes, we need to be going, and you need to head home right away. The way she spoke made it seem like someone's world was coming to an end. Is there something wrong back home, Kaichu? Sona nodded. She had been surprised to receive a call from the girls that had it well known that, if it weren't for Issei, they'd stay as far away from her and Reya's groups as possible. Your 2 Kendo friends called me. Apparently there was an altercation with one of the parents. Issei's eyes shot to the top of his brows. Shit already, I didn't think that was supposed to happen for another few days. He hurried over to his bag, zipped it shut and made his way back to his king in under 5 seconds. Kaichu, I don't want to interrupt time with your sister. But please, I need to get back and talk to them before they do something stupid. Line break. Mrs. Hayatu came into the living room, hearing the door open. She had been making a late-night snack for the 2 girls who were up in her son's room. One of them was a complete wreck, having just had what sounded like a big argument with her parents. And with them, if it involved one, the other was dragged into it as well. It broke her heart to see them so frightened and unsure of what to do. On home, she heard the voice of her son just as she came to the kitchen doorway. His appearance surprised her for multiple reasons. He had a tan, like he'd been out in the sun for the entire time he'd been gone. His shirt and pants looked like he'd run through a maze of razor blades. And he was 2 days early. Eyes, honey, what happened to your clothes? Issei waved her question off, setting his bag down on the entryway floor. Sorry, Mom, I'll explain later. Are Yui and Kaori here? Kaichu said that they called her asking for me, but I didn't bring my phone. Nodded with a smile. If Issei hadn't warned her about this possibility a few weeks ago, she would have been worried out of her mind for the 2 girls. They're in your room, and quite upset. Issei took off towards his room without another word. Issei ran up the stairs, taking 2 at a time. When he came to the top, he heard them whispering to each other. Kaori's voice made it apparent that she'd been crying heavily. He walked to his door, opening it slowly so as to not startle them. The only light inside was the lamp on his desk, giving the room a yellowish glow. Stepping through the doorway, Issei saw the 2 girls huddled together on his bed, comforting each other. The heads came up, expecting his mother. Kaori's eyes lit up once she saw it was him instead. Eyes, she yelled, springing from the bed and running into his arms. She buried her head into his chest, her hands pulled in to let herself be enveloped. The sobs renewed once she saw the person she was terrified of leaving behind. He gently wrapped his arms around the brunette, one hand on the center of her back, the other stroking the hair that was for once not held up by her usual red ribbons. What do I do, Eyes? He squeezed her body to his, trying to take her worries into himself. Live with me, both of you, he whispered. Her teary brown eyes snapped up to his. You knew. Issei gave her an apologetic smile as he nodded. I heard when you told Yui. I asked my parents about it, they both agreed. You can live here rent-free for as long as you like. If this were Momo or Reya, he would have expected the reaction. But when Kaori pulled him into a deep, tongue and all, he was unresponsive for more than a few seconds before returning it. Hey, no fair, you too. Katase jumped off the bed to separate her friends. When the 2 of them pulled away, Kaori refused to let him go, her hands on each side of his face, her light brown eyes boring into his. I love you, Eyes. Pervert, devil, dragon, harem king. I don't care. I need you to be in my life. Issei could only smile as she eyed him again. From an outside perspective, things would look as though everything is wonderful. I would mostly agree. Things in our little home have been nearly perfect these last few months. My husband Koji got promoted this year. My son got into a rather exclusive high school. My favorite soap opera got renewed for another few seasons. Those 2 wonderful girls moved into our home, have always wanted a daughter. Things right now are nearly perfect. But that doesn't help this crushing guilt I feel. I'm sure some would wonder just what in the world I had to complain or feel guilty about. It's because I almost ruined it all. I had been at the brink of tearing this family apart at the seams and hadn't even realized it. Every time I see my son, Issei, my heart clenches. Whenever Koji smiles at me, I inwardly cringe. How had I been so blind and stupid? When I was a little girl, my mother had frequently warned me about the more lecherous men I'd one day come into contact with. The women of my family had always started to develop rather early. I may not be at the level of the rest of my family had been, but I'm a bit bustier than the average Japanese woman. I took to wearing clothes that hid this fact when I was 14. High school and college had been filled with catcalls and leering men. The occasional grope was met with a knee to the testicles. I knew almost immediately that my husband was a pervert when we started dating. One night he'd gotten drunk enough to tell me that he'd dreamed of having a harem at one point. He made no attempts to hide the fact that he found me attractive. He also was very transparent that he wanted to know what laid in the mind, just as much as what was underneath the clothes. It had taken a rather long time for me to rein him in as much as I have. When we finally had Issei, the world became this scary thing I had to protect him from. I suppose it was a natural thing after 2 miscarriages and years of trying. Koji and I would do anything to make him happy and ensure he was safe. For the first 6 years, everything was perfect. We had this amazingly vibrant little boy, looking at the world with shining, inquisitive eyes. It still confuses me how he had such a hard time making friends. Even the parents of those pint-sized bullies didn't get it. And then came the Shido family and that darling little girl Arena. Those two were attached at the hip for the 2 years they lived next door. Issei was crushed when they left. That was also my spiral into the horrible mother I've been for the last 8 years. My son came home from the park one day, spouting nonsense about floating S in the magic they held. The key to happiness, Issei called them. I thought, hoped, it would pass. But it didn't. Perhaps it was a combination of my family's early Yule development and Koji's perversion. Maybe it was because Issei had no one to play with that he turned out that way. Though we had been so passive in disciplining him up to that point in his life. He hadn't really needed it before. He adored us, listened to whatever we said, and had never really gotten into trouble. By the time he was 9, all he seemed to talk or think about was something Yule. I slipped back into old habits. I berated my son, yelled at him, spanked him a number of times when I caught him looking at porn. The pinnacle of it all came when I found a magazine in his room. I spanked him, barehanded on bare bottom. Later that morning, I found our computer teeming with pictures of naked young women. That was the last straw, and I broke. I saw red and took a belt this time. Koji came home early that day and found me beating our son with the buckle of the belt. I had been so angry I hadn't noticed that part. I don't even know how long I'd been swinging, but Issei had stopped crying and just winced at each hit. The argument between Koji and I lasted for hours. He admitted that the porn was from him and not our son. That was a week after Issei's 11th birthday, the last day I hugged him. The last day I told him I loved him. From that point on, I was emotionally distant. Weeks turned into months, and I started picking up the occasional part-time job to keep busy. I spoke to my son the same way someone would an estranged second cousin at a family reunion. I treated my husband the same way I did those teachers and classmates who ogled me. Months turned to years, and the rift had only deepened between Issei and I. Koji had started working later and later, coming home only after the sun had set. Birthdays and anniversaries were the only time Koji and I would have, and it was half-hearted on my part. I believe that Kyoko's announcement was both a glimmer of hope and a path to ruin. Even though I hadn't shown it in years, I still loved my son and wanted him to succeed. The school was renowned for its quality education, but I thought the gender ratio would only get Issei into legal trouble. I wanted Issei to go to a good college, but didn't want him to be listed as an offender. I hadn't even known that Issei had started working out until he told me about his run to Kyo Academy. I pushed him to go back for the girls' help, because I just didn't want to deal with his antics anymore. When he came home with bruises, I thought he'd been lying about trying to correct his behavior and was just getting caught peeking at the girls. Until I had the pleasure to meet Kaori Murayama and Yui Katase, that is. Admittedly, I was rather cold to them the first few times. Girls as pretty and driven as them didn't hang around perverts like my son unless they were after something. Money, favors, a good laugh, I wasn't sure what it was. After a month of those two being around him though, I saw the change. I watched as my son regretfully tossed out his stash of magazines under threat of hardened wood against flesh. That was enough to chip away at the haze I had been in. When he came home a few days later with the worst bruises I'd ever seen on him, I just couldn't hold back from smothering him. My baby boy was hurt, and all I wanted to do was hug it away, to smother him with the love I'd withheld for too long. My mistakes all came rushing to me as my son stiffened in my grasp. Seeing him nearly in tears from a simple hug, I've been a horrible mother. One day, I'll sit Issei down and apologize for the way I treated him, just as I did with Koji. To know that the late nights Koji spent working had been optional, it hurt. It hurt even more to know that he was wondering how much longer he could take the strain. In other words, how long could he last before filing for divorce? He didn't want to spend time arguing with me or watching me treat our son the cold way I had been, so he spent that time on bettering his career. I watched as those two girls slowly but surely started to fall for the enormous heart that beat in my son's chest. When I tried to warn them that Koji had infected Issei with that idea, they simply said they knew about it and would be sure to beat it out of him. After the night that I collapsed, when Issei was assumed to be missing, I started to notice a few things. The first is how attentive Issei is with me. Our relationship is better than I'd hoped, and certainly better than I deserve. But it is a cause for concern at the moment. If I hadn't seen some of the games he'd managed to get a hold of, I may not have ever come to this conclusion. When Issei and I are in the same room, and no one is speaking directly to him, or he's not otherwise preoccupied, his eyes glance over to me every few seconds, almost as if he has trouble looking anywhere else. When he hugs me now, I can feel him almost melt into my arms, like he wants to be nowhere else. Part of me loves it, the other is worried and a little grossed out. I am not some cheating whore of a stepmother from one of those adult games. I am his biological mother. The affection I show him may be a little more than normal, but I'm just trying to make up for all that I kept locked away. Koji noticed it too, and had gotten a bit too aggressive with how he responded. but that seems to have passed thankfully. The second thing I've noticed since Issei started high school is the girls. I understand how Kaori and Yui both came to love my son, even if they deny it. But it's like the drives on some of the other girls is on overdrive from the moment I met them. Momo and Reya seem to already have deep feelings for Issei. I know that their hormones are running rampant at this point of their life, but my god, do they need to get themselves under control. I'm not ready to be a grandmother. 51 is too young. If that redhead starts making a move on Issei, I fear the battle is lost. I'm not sure I like that girl, she's much too charismatic to not be two-faced. But maybe I'm being too harsh, and my past experience with girls like that is clouding my judgment. The last thing is directly tied to the second, along with how Issei has been brought up. My son has no idea how to approach, interact, or start a relationship with a girl. All he's ever had are fantasies of well-established and physical relationships. And porn. I can only imagine the pain those girls' parents must feel. I heard the confession Kaori gave a while back, as the vents in the laundry room were directly below the room they were in. I felt it was necessary to swiftly intervene and give Issei an out. Poor Yui had clearly been working through her own feelings and coming to grips with them, and her best friend just ups and swoops in first. Before I could knock though, Kaori had said, "I know it's unfair of me to do this right now. To you, Yui, Momo and Reya, but I can't help it. I don't want an answer or for anything to change. I just wanted you to know." Honestly, I hadn't known the girl was so mature. The weeks that followed were interesting, to say the least. During the day, and in plain sight, nothing seemed to change between them. They got along as well as they always had. Sometimes a small argument over trivial things would come up. They were still teenagers after all. What caught my attention was the way all these girls seemed to know how the others felt, and still were marching forward to catching my son's affection for themselves. I even caught Yui sneaking into his room far too late one night. Knowing that she was against anything overly Yule, I wasn't too concerned, and decided to get up a little earlier to check on the state of things in the morning. It was adorable, finding Yui snuggled into Issei. She had draped one of his arms over herself and was holding onto it tightly. I was relieved to see they had clothes on, and there was no stench in the air. I hadn't been as quiet as was necessary, I suppose, because I turned around to find Kaori right behind me, looking directly at the scene as well. The brunette just smiled towards my son and her friend, and walked away to get ready for school. That leads to today. That redhead, Riaz I think her name was, had stolen Issei for the afternoon. It was obvious by what Issei said to me that it was a date. My oblivious son seemed to have no clue though. Kaori was meeting with her parents to discuss her permanent move to our home, so it was just Yui and I at the moment. I couldn't help but inquire about the strange way these girls were acting. I was worried that someone would get hurt, and then Issei would be caught in the middle of it, having no idea what he'd done wrong. Something his father and I were to blame for. I thought about how to word it carefully as the day progressed. Finally, while making lunch, I decided it might be better to be blunt. "Yui dear, I understand that this might sound callous, but I need to know something." My pink-haired companion brought her water bottle down from her lips and finally had done as I'd been bugging her to do for months. "What is it, Mother?" When I'd suggested that the two should call me Mom, at first it was just a joke. A way to tease how close they were to Issei, but somewhere along the line, that turned into a real desire to have them as my family. She'd only called me that 3 times now and admitted that she couldn't say Mom because she'd already had one. Mother was as close as I'd get, and that was fine. "I know you're in love with Issei, and I heard Kaori confess to him. Then there's those 2 student council girls, and the date with that Riaz girl today. How many girls are pining after my son, and how are any of you okay with this, knowing that there's others?" The girl had gone stiff, her hand clenched the water bottle, spilling a good portion of it onto the floor. Well, I did need to wash these hand towels anyway, so they'll do to wipe it up. I had time to place the towel on the floor and let it soak the fluid, before Yui came back from outer space. I should have known you'd see through me. "Honey, you're as transparent as Scotch tape. Kaori said you knew I snuck into his room." She sighed, obviously stalling for time, picking up the towel and placing it in the hamper I had placed around the corner in the living room. I sat down at the table, so she knew that I wasn't going to accept not getting an answer. She was fiddling with her hands when she sat across from me. I don't know exactly how the others feel, but I know Momo and Reya are pretty serious. Before deciding to be a stay-at-home mother, I had wanted to be a child and family counselor. So I knew, based on what I was seeing and hearing, that I would have to be the one to keep her on track. "Honey, please answer my question. I need to understand. And for the love of God, don't you dare lie to me. I've already caught Issei 3 times since he started high school. I don't need you girls doing it too." I couldn't very well say that to her though, it'd scare her stiff, and she'd clam up. There's 6 of us at the moment. I don't swear very often, but damn it, this is all my fault. I didn't stop Issei from diving into the murky depths of being a pervert. Now he was moving to be a womanizing pervert. I'm going to have a grandchild from who knows how many women. Then my son will be some lowlife who can't afford to pay for rent or a mortgage because of all the child support payments. Wait, at the moment there's going to be more. I think my heart's imploding. Yui couldn't make eye contact with me. At least she was being honest. "Yeah, I know how this sounds. Oh no, she's tearing up. I didn't want that. I didn't want to upset her. I just couldn't take being in the dark like this. Yui, I didn't." Those pink eyes, glistening with tears, look right up at me. "Issei will not be happy if he finds out I made her cry." It sounds like he's holding something over our heads to get us to go along with it. That, or we're all messing with him to gain something ourselves, like a group of selfish sluts. Not the words I would have used, but yes, basically. As Yui wiped at her eyes, I wanted to tell her that I didn't see her as that kind of a woman. Perhaps I thought she had developed some questionable morals as far as relationships go, but that's it. I'm sorry, I didn't want to start crying. I just feel like I'm getting left behind because I can't suck it up and say that I love him. It feels like my dad leaving all over again. We sat there for almost 20 minutes before Yui calmed down enough to keep talking. Yui, I just don't understand. It felt like I'd been saying that a lot lately. The hopeful daughter-in-law laughed at me. Neither does Ice. I couldn't stop the head tilt or confused sound from coming, which only made her laugh more. He's absolutely clueless. If Kaori hadn't said it right to his face, I don't think he'd ever get it. When Momo or Reya come up in him, Issei thinks they're just testing his self-control. He has no idea how they feel about him. And you're allocate with this. The very definition of a conflicted look came over her face. At that moment I knew that she wasn't entirely accepting of the whole, multiple partner situation she found herself in. I'd like to say no. Or maybe if it were just me and Kaori, I'd be able to swallow it easier. We've been friends forever and always want to live with each other. We've done everything together since we were 4. Koji can never know about this. He'd scream about his son completing his harem dream from a skyscraper with a megaphone. Then he'd probably try to persuade me to get in on the idea. And then I would have to finally tell him about his shortcomings. That is not a conversation I want to have, ever. Faking the second orgasm is a hell of a lot easier. You'd like to say no, but come on girl, if my mind can wander through several different thoughts and still keep up, you gotta speed it up. Yui shook her head. She mumbled something she obviously didn't mean for me to hear, but I'm used to listening for a boy who liked to hide his porn habits from me. Why are you pressing so hard? She looked to me with a bright blush. Here we go, now I get to hear how my son is building a harem and not even knowing about it. One of the times I snuck into his room, I didn't intend on laying there all night. One of the times I saw it happen before I caught you. It was when he was sick, I went in to check on him. He was mumbling, so I leaned in to hear what he was saying. This is starting to feel too much like a cheesy romance movie. Keep going. It was too incoherent, so I was just gonna head back to bed. When I went to stand and leave, he turned, and his arm brought me down to the bed. Huey wasn't even seeing me anymore, now she was reliving the memory. I don't think I've ever seen that loving smile on her face when she was with my son. She'd done a commendable job of hiding it from him. Issei is a lot stronger than he looks, and I couldn't move. When his arm pulled me in closer, it was like ... Come on, don't stop now, it's just getting good. I mean, I get that we're talking about my son here, but this sounds so sweet. Like he would do anything to just keep me there in his arms. It was so warm. Ooh, your blush is so cute, I just want to pinch your cheeks and hug you. Somehow, he knew it was me he was holding on to. I know the smile that's on her face right now. I've seen it, I've felt it. I snuck in 3 more times before the one you saw. Every time, it's the same. He holds me like I'm all that matters, even after Kaori confessed. I'm sure the whole handful of girls chasing him thing will bug me. What if the way he holds me never changes? I'll never leave. I should still be upset that my son seems to be leading these girls on, even if it's unknowingly. I should feel responsible for the morally wrong choices that I have led him towards in my negligence. But looking at Yui at this moment, I can't help but feel proud of what is happening before my eyes. My son is finally getting the love he deserves. It's an incredibly abnormal situation, but when has Issei ever been normal? As long as everyone is at the same understanding that Yui is, I guess it's just not my place to intervene. There is still something I want to know though. He said that Momo and Reya were serious. What about that Reya's girl? The speed at which Yui narrowed her eyes was astonishing. Between that and her clenched jaw, it was obvious how she felt about the busty redhead. Kaori and I are doing anything we can to keep her away from him. That was apparently the end of our discussion, because Yui had gotten up and left. I guess my intuition about her was right. So why is Issei on a date with her right now? Hold on a moment, I never found out who the 6th girl was. Walking through the crowded streets, one arm being held onto rather securely, and the other in his pocket, Issei was confused. Yesterday, his king had asked if he'd assist Reya's. Having no plans for the day, he'd agreed, thinking it was something devil-related in some way. As far as he could tell, nothing about where they'd gone or anything they'd done was related to the supernatural, other than the amount of money that had been thrown around. That certainly wasn't normal. Taking the train into the same general area that Issei had met up with his old friends, he discovered that there was a similar setup only a few blocks away. Most were stores that catered to media and pop culture, with stands selling merchandise for musicians, movies, and other groups just outside. Seeing the price tags made him realize the reason why this area seemed so different from the one he usually visited. Exclusive t-shirts and other clothing from the tour, figurines with certificates of authenticity, meet and greet tickets for artists that usually never did them. All of it was at least 3 times what he'd usually see. This set of shops and stands were for the upper class, a way to separate themselves from the common rabble of otakus and fanatics. Issei found it rather insulting. Part of what was so amazing about these fanbases was how they could all come together over a single topic. It didn't matter whether you were rich or poor or what you did for work. Conventions were much the same to him. Underneath whatever costume you chose was a person with a passion. That was what mattered, not the clothes or the status you held. He was starting to regret his choice of apparel as the heat of the day kicked in. Low-top black and white Chuck Taylor shoes, khaki pants, plain red t-shirt with a black button cardigan that was left open. The only accessory he had on at the moment was the bracelet of the Gold Dragon King on his right wrist. The pants were fine, but he probably should have checked how hot it would be today when he decided to wear the cardigan. "How about we stop for lunch?" Reya said from directly to his left, still attached to his arm. Having only seen her a few times and talked to her once, Issei was surprised by how close she was to him today. Although if he were being honest, the wide-eyed stares they got when walking past the shop owners that he knew was pretty damn satisfying. "Sounds good to me. Did you have anything in mind?" he asked, his eyes not able to keep from wandering up and down her frame. Unlike Issei, Reya had chosen something to wear that let her stay nice and comfortable. A white sundress that reached a little more than halfway to her knees. The strap looped around her neck instead of the usual shoulder straps. Her crimson hair, normally flowing freely, was tied into a ponytail. It was as if everything had been meticulously chosen to show off just the right amount of skin or cleavage. Women were truly devious and calculating creatures. She wore no makeup, not that she needed any, aside from some lip gloss. Her skin was perfect, light complexion with no blemish, scars or other marks to be seen. She had no reason to resort to the sorcery known worldwide as cosmetics. Reya had her own peerage to assist her in anything she wanted. So what was this prime example of young feminine beauty doing asking for his company on what was little more than a shopping spree? If she were human, her figure alone would have made picking any guy to escort her a breeze. Those blue-green eyes glimmered with a clarity and shine that would captivate those who didn't care to look. And her silky voice would have turned the heads of those trying to ignore anyone around them. Her smile and personality only further added to her already staggeringly perfect image. They had met up at his house for reasons she hadn't explained. His father had been about to set off to work on some project that was taking up a lot of his time, and had nearly become a drooling mess on the floor when he answered the door. Reya had been polite to everyone home, but for some reason, Yui and his mother weren't as receptive to her as the males in the household. The heiress tapped her chin, scanning the street for somewhere to grab a bite to eat. She must have seen somewhere that caught her attention, because she immediately set her course. "Let's try this place up ahead." She had smoothly brought her arm from its place wrapped around his, and down to lace their fingers together as she guided them forward. Issei quickly adjusted to the change of pace, only being dragged for half a second. He did slightly raise an eyebrow at the change to her holding of his hand. He didn't mind. In fact, he quite enjoyed the soft touch of her hand, but it did paint an impossible picture from an outside perspective. A young man and woman spending time together in the city. The woman holding herself close to the young man beside her, smiling as they talked about various things. Taking in the surroundings and the appearance of the duo, it would look like a date. One in which an average-looking guy who probably had too much money on his hands had bribed his way into getting the girl's attention. In this part of the city, it had been seen too many times to count. Guy sees a beautiful girl that is so far out of his league, they might as well reside in different galaxies. Guy whispers sweet words of never-ending gifts and extravagant vacations. Guy puts on a front of the caring and loving boyfriend, until the girl inevitably lowers her guard enough to lay on the bed of lies and deceit, being stripped of the innocence that had endeared her to him. Getting what he wants, the guy moves on to the next unsuspecting gem that catches his eye. Rinse and repeat. The bystanders and shop owners would never know just how wrong that assumption is. It was more likely to be the other way around. Line break, classes, paperwork, clients, peerage duties. It seemed as though it was a never-ending cycle. Throw in the occasional meeting with her family, and Sona was ready for a break. Before this school year, it was relatively easy, given her talents. She was a natural at running the school from the shadows, and had been doing so since the beginning of her first year. Her time management was impeccable, her attention to detail precise. She shuddered at what would happen when the figurehead that was the current student council president returned from her time away. That girl had no respect for the job, all it was to her is a popularity contest. She made a note to tell Issei that he had to start wearing the bracelet at school soon. But Sona wasn't certain that would be enough. Issei wouldn't know what hit him, and the girls would be upset if Isla got to him first. Damn succubus, she's lucky to have descended from one of the queens. Sona would have booted her out of the territory otherwise. It felt nice to know that she could handle the workload that would be expected of her once she opened her own school. But there was still so much to do. Property to obtain, a building to construct, teachers to interview and hire, students to enroll, tuition to calculate, and salaries to negotiate. Taking her glasses off, Sona rubbed the bridge of her nose. She'd been staring at this particular form for a while now. There were several pages documenting a timeline of events to come, and the last few pages detailing a contract. The papers were only part of what was causing her head to throb. It was surprising to see that it was her far too affectionate sister that gave the least resistance to her plan. It just went to show that Serafal truly only wanted what made Sona happy. Not that Serafal had any say in family matters anymore. Her parents only even listened because she emphasized how her plans would further the reputation of the Citri name and the influence they'd gain. The fact that she was looking to marry a mere servant still grated on their pride and nerves. "Sona, take a break and have something to eat, please," her queen said as she walked into the office, a tray with a variety of sandwiches spread about. Setting the tray on the desk, covering the papers, it was clear to Sona that Tsubaki wouldn't take no for an answer. "You win. Just a small break," she said with a sigh. Tsubaki sat across from her, both picking up a sandwich. As the queen finished her first and prepared to eat one more before getting back to work, Tsubaki broke the silence. "How is the planning coming along?" Their reactions were less than pleasant. Sona placed her cup down back onto its saucer, giving her friend an exasperated look. "My parents refuse to help with something they see as a pipe dream. They made it abundantly clear how they view my plans for the future." Somehow, Lord and Lady Citri had gotten wind that Sona was looking at property near the edge of their controlled lands. The meeting that resulted from that was less than cordial. It was heated, filled with curse words and rather negative depictions of her character. In an uncharacteristically emotional display, Tsubaki placed a hand over her own, a sad smile on her lips. "They're wrong. They're wrong about you, and they're wrong about him." It was something that only Sona had seen before. Tsubaki never liked showing how she felt about anything to anyone else. The rest of her peerage was fairly new, and there hadn't been anything to bring out the real Tsubaki since any of them had joined. Hopefully that would change sometime this school year, because they were all tiptoeing around her still. Especially her pawn. Sona couldn't blame him either. Sona kept her mask up just about all the time, and hadn't really had a chance to connect with him yet. It was just that, there was so much to do, so much to prepare him for. To be what she needed, Issei had to have power, enough power to overwhelm someone touted as a prodigy amongst his already powerful family. He would need to develop a mind capable of strategy cunning enough to outplay the nobles that would seek to see him drown in the depths of inferiority. He needed to be at the level of a pureed devil that had trained most of their life, and he only had a year to do it. Those circumstances didn't leave a lot of time for niceties, pleasant conversations, flirting and dates. Things that she could feel he wanted, through her ever-growing connection to him. Sona had never lied to Issei, but she had certainly left a large portion of the details out. She felt that was for the best, at least for now. She had told him that people would be watching him once he became known to the masses. Those of lower standings would be watching to see what another localess devil could accomplish when given the opportunity. Those of the upper class would watch to see what a Longinus user would bring to their race. Would the fact that he held one of the 13 treasured tools of God bring chaos, or would it be the thing they needed to make the other factions be more wary of taking them lightly? Lucifer and Beelzebub were decent enough at that, being stronger than almost every other being alive. But having another certainly wouldn't hurt. "Thank you, Tsubaki. Words alone won't be enough to show my parents how wrong they are. He may have won over my sister already, which is surprising enough as it is, but he's not ready to face the challenges ahead of us yet." Tsubaki nodded to her king, bringing her hand back to resume her lunch. As Sona made to do the same, she wondered if a year was enough time to get it done. "Even if I can persuade Tiamat to train him, I'm not sure that'll be enough. His strength is coming along nicely, but that means nothing against an opponent that can regenerate almost endlessly." There was still much to do to prove her parents and the devils as a whole that heritage isn't everything. But the thing she wanted to prove the most was that her mother was wrong. Issei Citri would regret calling her daughter a lowballing whore, relegating herself to a $5 prostitute, whose only goal was to find a man with a hint of ambition so she could spread her legs and said man into keeping her around because she amounted to nothing herself. Needless to say, the mother of Sona Citri had a rather colorful vocabulary when she was angered or caught off guard. If Sona were the type to retort to her elders, she would have asked her mother, "Isn't that exactly what you did?" That statement wasn't worth the repercussions, for obvious reasons. She wanted their support, not to be disowned. It wouldn't have mattered how good saying that would have felt. Line break. The waitress had come and taken their orders, gave them some water until the drinks were prepared, and made herself scarce. The place Reya chose was nice. An open-air cafe, the windows and doors removed to let the warm breeze and fans keep the customers cool and comfortable. It felt like a place you'd expect to see in an area that never dropped below early summer temperatures. This area of Japan didn't get nearly as cold as others up north, but it still did get to freezing for a small portion of winter. The feel of the place was relaxed, but had a distinct upper-class look, just as the shops they'd gone in. The servers were in well-maintained uniforms, the floor was freshly waxed. The decorations were light in number, but well-placed and helped to only boost the atmosphere. Noticing that there were no prices on the menu, Issei decided to just go with something simple and cheap, so he didn't drain too much of the cash in his wallet. They can be a little heavy-handed sometimes, but they mean well. The worst time was when we were looking for the tailor that did our uniforms, Issei admitted as he rubbed the back of his head. Reya had brought up the topic of his two Kendo friends, after she confirmed that the two were currently living with him. She'd inquired about how they met and the progression of their friendship. To her, it was both a way to make conversation during the time their food was being prepared, and a way to learn more about him. Gathering information on the romantic situation was merely a bonus. He'd pretty much been an open book, not shying away from anything she asked. It was refreshing to meet someone like that. The more she heard, the more interested she became in the small details, either about him or the situation he described. I take it, you got into a little girl trouble, she said, humor clear in her voice. Her teasing smile made that even more apparent. Yeah, you can say that. The training afterwards was pretty brutal. Issei winced a bit, remembering the vicious beatdown he got after hitting on what had to be the hottest older women he'd ever seen. I can't believe they dragged me away like that. She was actually flirting back. So not fair, he thought bitterly. Issei would forever remember that face and body. Long legs, wide hips, possibly after effects of being a mother, small waist with huge tits that bounced like none he'd ever seen. And that face at waist enchanting. Sharp features, soft skin, with those piercing violet eyes. Her brown, medium-length layered hair just made her eyes pop more. Chances are that he'll never see her again. Which was a shame, because he would never know just where that talk could have led them. But enough about me. What about you, Ms. Japanophile? If you had to pick one thing you liked the best about Japan, what would it be? Issei asked that, just to draw attention away from himself. He wanted to know more about the girl he'd agreed to try and save, but mainly he just didn't want to embarrass himself today. If he did, Sona would hear about it in no time. Issei was looking for ways to get into his own king's good graces. They got along well enough, and their connection through his 8 pieces certainly helped. But aside from being able to get a vague idea of what she was feeling, he really knew next to nothing about Sona Citri. He knew that she loved her peerage, but it was always work with her. Issei wanted to know how to get her to loosen up for an afternoon and have some fun. Reya's eyes lit up, and her fanaticism came out in full force as she animatedly talked about anything she found interesting about the country. Line break. Reya stared, wide-eyed, at her date. Every part of her body tingled in joyous rapture at what had just happened. Her breathing came in haggard rasps, uneven and difficult. Her cheeks felt like they were burning with that same deep red fire Issei had displayed in the few training sessions she had been witness to. She would deny to the end of time that her paternal trait was flaring up in full force, causing her nipples to be harder than diamonds and as sensitive as a champlain, and her rose sopping and ready to be plucked until she couldn't sit, stand, or lay comfortably, preferably for the next week if she had any say in it. The bracelet that Issei was wearing had been an increasing curiosity for her throughout their day together. Black and gold links with obvious supernatural runes expertly carved into them. Other than the markings and craftsmanship, it didn't appear all that special to her. But by the Satans was she wrong. After their meal, a rather mediocre one for the price in her opinion, she had decided to walk while holding onto his right arm. She had been thoroughly enjoying his company today. Reya knew that Issei was hiding all sorts of dirty, perverted, and possibly kinky thoughts about her and a number of the girls they'd seen. But even so, they had found similar interests that made being with each other casual and effortless. Being that they were in the heart of otaku country, anime was a common topic. Reya had been pleasantly surprised to hear about the depth in which Issei Hayato loved his family, a facet of him that was mirrored by her own ideals. Finding out that protecting the ones he cared for was a main reason in his joining of the Citri peerage warmed her heart. She would just have to earn the acceptance and approval of the women living at his house, something that she was already starting to make plans for. Mr. Hayato was not an obstacle in this regard that was apparent when they met this morning. The light glinting off the bracelet brought her attention to it, making her take a closer look as they walked off to the next shop she had wanted to visit. Her curiosity had reached its peak when she caught sight of the dragon carved into the gold links, and she couldn't help herself. Ever since learning that he was the Red Dragon Emperor and hearing the voice of Elsha Levitain, she had been infinitely more curious about both Aiz himself and dragons as a whole. Unfortunately, she and her peerage had been kept busy by clients and the annual increase in strays. Summer had always brought about more servants rebelling against their masters, as the longer days decreased the weaker masters living in the human world. Aside from catching a glance of him during school, they'd only spoken the day she bumped into him at the beginning of the term. Reya had been looking forward to getting to know him better and learn more about him herself. Hearing about him from Sona and Tsubaki was nice and all, but they always gave a somewhat lackluster review. They never mentioned anything about interests, only about his training and how he handled his own temptations with women. As long as things stayed the course they were going today, Reya could honestly see her and Issei coming to love each other over time, if they didn't already by the wedding day. Walking into a shop that sold somewhat obscure manga, Reya wanted to find a gift to bring her adorable nephew Milikas for when she went home during the break. Sure, his mother would be unhappy about the gift not having anything of value to add to his education, but it would make him happy. And that was what Reya wanted the most. His parents and grandparents could handle the rest. She wanted to be the fun aunt. "Your nephew likes manga," Issei asked her, scanning over the long aisle of books that had been collecting dust for a while. Picking one up about a team of militarized squirrels, Reya nodded. "I think I might have influenced him a bit too much to his parents' liking." She chuckled, remembering the looks that Grafia had given her. The boy needed to have more fun. He wasn't being prepared to be the next head of the family, so he deserved it. "You're only a kid once." Issei smiled as he agreed with her. He wasn't the suave, pretty boy type that you'd see charming girls by the dozen. Issei had his own charm. It was much slower to catch you in its grasp, but so much more effective. His desire to make the women in his life happy added to the dragon's aura that slowly leaked from him. It was like a black hole slowly dragging you into its center. Once you were there, you'd never escape. Part of her wondered if she'd ever want to. Reya had disregarded something she heard in passing from Momo and Reya when she'd conversed with Sona. Something about a tidal wave of that dragon energy. She thought they must just be inexperienced with more powerful beings. What she had felt all day was nowhere near as powerful as they'd described. Now that she had something for her nephew, Reya set her sights on teasing her date, to see just how he'd react to all of the pictures while being with her. The shop she had lured him into was known for its obscure collection, but also for its large section of awfully explicit material. Issei hadn't given any indication that he'd seen the curtain off to their left, marking the adult-only section. Sliding her fingers down his arm to once again lace their fingers together, Reya tugged him towards it. "Let's head over here. There's something my queen wanted me to find." Akino had said that she wouldn't mind a few materials to refine her tendencies, but she'd never said that Reya should go looking for them, or asked her to for that matter. For oblivious, Issei just nodded and walked along with her towards the curtain. Just before Reya had walked through it, she could feel Issei stiffen behind her, having realized where they were going. The small hiccup passed, and he reluctantly walked along into the area. Coming through the curtain, the light was rather dim. The covers of each book, placed as though they were enshrined here, were unreadable in the current light. That was most definitely on purpose. What shop owner would want people masturbating in their back room? Reya watched as Issei passed underneath and joined her, looking straight at her and nowhere else. She hid her smile and pretended to look through the various fetish sections, while keeping an eye on him discreetly. Reya noticed a group of covers with rather large busted women, and saw Issei had trouble not looking at them. That was good to know. There would be no problem in his desire for her body, even though she hadn't really been worried about that from the start. Try as he might, Issei had been occasionally checking her out throughout the day. Mostly her chest, put on display as it was with her low-cut sundress. She had gotten used to being stared at a long time ago, so it didn't bother her, as long as that was where it ended. Touching required permission, which she had never given to any man. "Lady Gremory, would you mind if I waited outside?" She stopped immediately. The usage of her title and last name was slightly alarming. He'd taken her advice, and just called her Reya almost all day. Right now, it felt like they were back to square one. Am I making him uncomfortable? She hadn't thought, with the history he had in middle school, that he'd be at all put out by this scenario. Reya figured that being in a porn section with a beautiful girl would be a huge turn-on for him, possibly a bit distracting, but that's it. His eyes were closed tightly now, as if he didn't trust himself to be in here with her. Not wanting to sound worried that she had gone too far with her prank, Reya tilted her head and asked him as innocently as she could, "Do you not like being in here with me?" Without opening his eyes, Issei shook his head. "I'm a guy, a pretty perverted one at that. Being in here with a girl as drop-dead gorgeous as you is like accomplishing a weird dream I didn't even know I had." He slowly opened one eye to look only at her. "But that part of me has only ever caused trouble. I've worked really hard to control myself, and ever since joining Kaichu, it's only gotten harder." Thinking over the group of girls that he had to spend extended amounts of time with, specifically the bishops and the Kendo girls, she could see his dilemma. The Citri bishops were encouraging him to make a move on them, while the two human girls were adamant that he hold himself back. Stepping closer, Reya's hand stopped on his right wrist where the bracelet was. No longer wanting to play with him, she was starting to feel a little bad about it, putting all the work he'd put into himself in jeopardy. "Okay, I'm sorry for doing this to you. I just wanted to mess with you a little." Sliding her fingers over the cool metal, Reya saw Issei open his eyes directly towards her, still not wanting to chance looking around. "But while we're alone, could I ask you one question?" He nodded, her index finger and thumb coming to latch onto the bracelet, wanting to drag it into view as she asked her question. But it was never able to be brought forth. The spot her fingers had grabbed was right on the clasp, pressing the sides in and releasing it from his wrist. Her hand lifted just enough to remove the jewelry completely from him, leaving it dangling in between her fingers. There was no wind, no physical force that acted upon her, but Reya's would testify on her entire family's life and fortune that something had encompassed her entire being. At that moment, the room turned black except for one thing, one person, Issei Hayaodu. When she had removed the bracelet, he became everything, the only thing that she could see, hear, touch or taste. Between the absolute black and the man before her was a deep red aura. It was deeper than the color of her hair, darker than the power her mother gave her, that Surzets wielded with masterful precision. It swirled around him like a fire that had no flame, no target. But the hunger was there. It wanted everything. It wanted her, this shop, this city, this country. It wanted the world to bow to it, and wouldn't stop until it had achieved that very goal. To ravage the world in its fiery dominance. All that Reya's Gremory was and ever would be was insignificant compared to that, to him. A part of her realized that she should be afraid, terrified even, of who stood in front of her. Tales of the Red Dragon Emperors of old often depicted dozens of enemies being frozen in fright and awe as they realized the folly of standing against that single being. Against the one encased in the red armor of the Dragon of Domination, they were nothing but ants. Even as that fiery aura shifted, swirling around the two of them, Reya felt nothing but desire. As her pupils dilated, and her body felt like it was burning from the inside out unless it was ravaged by Issei, she stepped towards him. Reya's mind was nearly empty, except for the desire to strip down and present herself to him, hoping that he'd enjoy the show she would put on, just for him. For weeks after the events that occurred in that curtained-off area, Reya couldn't even stand to be in the same hallway as Issei, too embarrassed by what she'd done. Reya's face had been as red as her hair when Sona forced her to reveal the details. She truly should have known better when she told Sona that her pawn's evil pieces were acting up. Line break. Sitting up in her bed, Momo looked to her phone, which was lighting up her ceiling at the moment as it rang. She moved the blanket, revealing how sheer the ice blue nightgown she had donned was. If she were wearing a bra at all, you'd be able to see it, clear as day. She hated wearing underwear to bed. It got uncomfortable with her being a hot sleeper. The thin garment was as far as she could go, so she didn't wake up covered in sweat. Picking the device up off her nightstand, she blinked to get used to the change in light. Her curiosity was piqued as she saw the name of the caller, Kaori Murayama. She had only called her once since they'd started to become friends. It was definitely strange for her to be calling after midnight though. Something must have happened with eyes that she wanted to talk about. Pressing the green button, Momo brought it up to her ear, trying to sound more awake than she truly was at the moment. "Hello Kaori, what's up?" Momo adjusted the strap that was threatening to leave her shoulder. "No." A white eyebrow quirked upwards. "Have I missed something?" The girl's voice sounded strained. Kaori had told her and Reya that she'd be meeting with her parents today, and would probably have a parental meeting with the Hayadu family soon. "I think we all have." Kaori must be fairly agitated to be so short with her right now. Momo had been thankful that the two human girls had warmed up to at least her and Reya as quickly as they had. They talked without Issei around with some frequency, so she had been able to pick up on a few habits and tics the brunette had. "Kaori, I can tell that you are upset about something. Take a breath and tell me what it is. I know you called me for a reason." Her enhanced hearing caught the signs of Reya moving about, probably from the ringing of the cell phone waking her up. Her roommate probably thought they were being summoned for an emergency stray hunt. Momo heard Kaori take her advice, taking a deep and slow breath, letting it out the same way. Issei had his date with Reya's today. The door to her bedroom opened, revealing Reya in just her bra and panties. It was quite something to see how long her friend's hair was when out of the braids. It reached down to her knees when unrestrained. It was wavy thanks to her preferred hairstyle. Reya leaned against the door frame to wait and hear what their orders might be, if there were any. "Yes, he did. What happened that has you so upset?" Momo smiled towards Reya, watching as the brunette devil wiped at her eyes. She flashed her phone towards her briefly, so Reya could see the name on the screen. Reya nodded, letting her posture relax a bit, before walking over. "He wouldn't say. He was all smiles when I got home though, so obviously something happened." Reya sat beside Momo, leaning her head on Momo's shoulder. Momo draped her arm around her friend, rubbing her shoulder as she talked on the phone. "You didn't press for him to tell you." She was honestly surprised. Those two girls were very protective and nosy when it came to Issei and each other. "I wouldn't want someone getting all the details, if I were in that position. He's also been very affectionate, tonight." Momo pouted as she heard that. "How affectionate?" Kaori paused, seemingly unsure if she wanted to share what had happened earlier. The resigned sigh came over the line. "Pinned me to the wall and ed me until we were both almost blue in the face." That affectionate. Now that was certainly out of character for Issei. She wished she had been there to get in on the action. For some reason, he still didn't see her and Reya's actions as true romantic affection. "I hope Yui wasn't in eyesight," Momo said cautiously. Reya had caught the last full sentence from Kaori and was now paying very close attention. The two of them had a conversation pertaining to upping their game just the other day. The only thing holding them back had been the agreement between them and the Kendo duo. "She was," Kaori admitted. "When he was done with me, he gave her a hug that was so close that I was almost jealous he didn't do that instead, then ed her on the cheek before bouncing up to his room." Momo thought for a moment, moving her hand from Reya's shoulder to stroke her long silky hair. The other bishop gave a content sigh, melding back into her friend's side. "Then something must have happened between the two. But your first words make it seem like your certain things didn't go too far. Otherwise I think you'd be with him, a few pieces of clothing removed, rather than talking to me." Momo smirked at the embarrassed groan that came to her ear as Reya giggled in amusement. "Do devils have no shame? Seriously, it makes me think you're all just ready to get naked at a moment's notice." Momo stopped stroking Reya and sat up towards the edge of the bed. "I don't hear you denying it. We're more susceptible to our urges, but we are able to control ourselves." Reya sat up, snatching the phone from Momo's hand and placing it to her own ear. She gave Momo a wink before speaking. "Hello Kaori. So tell me, how long will it be before I can blasphemously scream his name to the heavens? I'm counting the days until I can have him thrusting into me so hard that I can't see straight." Hearing the human choke on air on the other end of the line was music to her ears. Momo covered her mouth so she wouldn't burst out laughing, making the situation worse. "Why are we friends again?" Kaori's voice lacked any emotion. Reya gave the girl credit for how fast she recovered. She hoped that it was a sign that all limitations to the truce would be called off soon. "Whatever, no, and anything else is fair play." Reya smirked and decided to play with the girl just a bit more. "Oh, so if I wanted and he was willing, I could take that throbbing hard." Momo quickly snatched the phone back from her friend and gave her a tap on the head for antagonizing the human girl. "Bad Reya, down girl." Reya stuck her tongue out towards Momo, wholly unrepentant for her actions. Sorry about that, Kaori, she's getting antsy. Momo laid herself down, legs hanging off the side of the bed, her free hand resting on her stomach. I know. How are you holding up? There were a few ways she could answer that question. Momo could go into the nitty-gritty of how she was keeping herself composed when around a certain pawn, but she knew that Kaori would just pull back. It was best to let her infer the details, rather than lay it all out. Reya had obtained a certain, battery-operated device that she used to ease the tension. Momo had decided against doing the same, preferring to take a more personal approach. Warm fingers were much better than room-temp silicone in her opinion. Kaori did not want to hear about that. Momo and Reya didn't disagree on much, was one of only 3 topics. Reya tried to persuade Momo to use her new toy, saying that it would make her real first time more enjoyable, not having to go through the pain of her hymen tearing. Momo, however, believed that it was a part of the experience and connection between lovers. She wanted that experience in its entirety. I want more. How much more? I don't know. I get it. It's the same for me. There was silence over the phone as the 2 girls thought about their perceived boundaries. How's Yui coming along? Reya asked from the side, back to her composed self. Momo brought the phone away from her ear and put it on speaker so they could all converse easier. The question was repeated, just in case Kaori had missed it. That's actually a part of the reason I called. The 2 devils gave each other a confused look briefly. Yui is close, I think. She had a talk with his mom today that seemed to help give her a little more courage. She snuck into his room again tonight. Reya smiled along with Momo. That was mostly good to hear. But now his mom wants to talk to the 4 of us. She knows that we're all looking to be in a relationship with him towards her. The smile dropped off their faces. They hadn't really considered how to explain things to his parents. The shared thought had been to just hide it from them. Look, this whole thing is still confusing to me. I don't know even how a monogamous relationship truly works, let alone whatever this is. But I know Issei, and honesty is something he values very highly. I think we should be as honest with her as possible, without going into the whole devil part. Line break. Issei watched from his state of astral projection as Yui once again snuck into his bed. The first time he saw her do it, he felt both nervous and embarrassed. It was something that seemed so intimate. But his pink-haired friend was always the quicker one to lash out. So he was sure that Yui would let him know if she didn't like anything that transpired that she didn't like. The third time he was aware of it happening, he noticed the way she relaxed after she settled in. That was how he got over the negative thoughts and just enjoyed the moment. Issei greatly enjoyed the thought of him being the thing she sought for comfort. Seeing her come into his room tonight was a little different. She didn't look like she came in for whatever comfort he afforded her. This time, she looked like she was trying to work herself up for something. What it was, he didn't know. You and I both know that's not true, eyes, Elsha thought to him. They had been practicing his projection yet again to see how long he could hold himself in the Norsafire dragon at a distance. Tonight they had floating 500 feet in the air for about 40 minutes. What if I'm wrong though? It could ruin our friendship if I just assume that she's interested in me that way. That was why he hadn't really done anything after Kaori confessed to him, not even give her a reply. Kaori said that she didn't want things to change. Issei took it to mean that, even though she said she was in love with him, she didn't want a relationship. Honestly, it was all very confusing. Why bother telling him then? Being able to her without fear was pretty awesome though. Trust me when I say, you're not wrong. She just needs some time to get it out. Since the events at the end of his day with Rias, Issei had been in a mindset close to his old middle school days. The 2 of them had silently agreed not to talk about what transpired in that dimly lit room. As such, he made no attempts to stop himself from taking in the image of Elsha, who decided that she would only appear in clothes inside the boosted gear, or when he finally manifested her for others to see. So far, this trick had been his little secret. His selfish desire to keep her to himself. Back to the topic at hand, if Yui noticed his rerouted flow, it wasn't apparent. I should talk to her, he thought, more to himself than to Elsha. That he should. We'll end things here for tonight. She dispersed into scattering golden particles. Pulling himself from the projected state had gotten much easier over time, and no longer threatened to make him nauseous. His eyes remained closed, as he felt Yui drape his arm over her like she usually did. He pulled her closer gently, almost an automatic reaction now, as he thought about what to say to her. He'd momentarily forgotten that he was pitching a tent. Stiffening for only a moment, Yui mumbled to herself. What the hell are you dreaming about? Damn thing is rock hard. And poking right into the gap between her upper thighs. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced it, but this one was definitely more pronounced. She had become aware that morningwood was most definitely not a myth. The jury was still out on blue balls. Issei could feel his entire body heat up, embarrassed by her description. Elsha often had that effect on him, even without him touching her. The worst time was when she started dancing naked. Sorry, he whispered, forgetting that he had still been pretending to sleep until he thought of the right words to say. If it weren't for the fact that she was being held in place, Yui would have jumped out of the bed when his voice startled her. You're awake, she asked in a quiet and high-pitched whisper. Not wanting to make the situation awkward with his current state, Issei went to move his arm away. Yui wasn't letting that happen and firmly held onto the limb. Her thumb stroked the hardened and warmer than normal skin, a habit she'd developed after she snuck in just after his reincarnation. Hey, something seemed off when I noticed you coming in. I thought you might want to talk. A soft smile crossed her lips, and she held the arm a little firmer for a moment. A gesture that said she appreciated him wanting to comfort her, not that Issei had done anything different whenever he thought she was upset. Is there something you want to talk about? I mean. Yui bit her lower lip lightly, the anxiety she felt over the subject coming back full force. Now she was almost regretting coming in his room. She wasn't ready to say it, not yet. Do I have to say I love you? Do I have to be okay as one of many? Do I have to be willing to sleep with you to prove it? To have my feelings reciprocated? Do I have sleep with them? Do I have to be held at a lower standing because I'm human? Do I have to? She wanted to barrage him with these questions, but she was just too scared to. The answers could be scarier than she was able to handle. You don't have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable, he answered. Even though he hadn't heard her thoughts, his response covered all of them. Issei wasn't good with reading between the lines with most of the girls he was around all the time. But it seemed as though he had a greater understanding when it came to Kaori and herself. Momo and Reya would have to set him straight soon, or their chances might just be ruined. If Sona was serious about that whole marriage thing, she had even more work ahead of her. Yui would have included Reya's in that scenario too, but she had obviously made her interest known today, if his affectionate giddiness was anything to go by. She wanted to hear the details of what happened to have such an effect on him. Did I overstep with the on the cheek? More like, didn't step far enough, was what she wanted to say. Issei was watching and feeling for how she would respond. He was trying to get any nonverbal admissions that he was right. The girl in his arms, along with the one down the hall, were immensely important to him. They were people he could trust, people he could rely on, and they had given him his family back. Their beauty was just a bonus, both inside and out. Yes, they beat on him every so often, but it was acknowledged and agreed upon from the beginning. If he slipped, they'd give a physical corrective measure. Behind that, though, were two young women who wanted to help someone that acknowledged there was a problem. Someone who wanted to better himself, just as they did every day with their Kendo training. I don't want you to treat Kaori and I differently, she mumbled. It wasn't an answer to either of his questions, verbal or nonverbal. But in a way, it was an answer to both. With anyone else, he probably wouldn't have understood and asked her to clarify what she meant. But spending nearly every day with them let Issei understand. He hadn't overstepped, but she would have liked to like the one he had shared with Kaori. She wasn't ready to say it, but she did love him. If he ended up being wrong about any of this, Yui was sure to reprimand him. What was it Matsuda said after watching that one American movie? Ah, that's right. Gotta risk it to get the biscuit. In other words, go for it. With his arm that wasn't around her, Issei propped himself up, the movement making her look over her shoulder. Her grip hadn't let his arm go, and Issei used that to turn Yui onto her back, leaving her halfway underneath him. She looked curious about his movements, and also a bit nervous because of the position they were in. Her grip relaxed enough for him to remove his hand, bringing it up to her cheek. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly, asking a silent question. The hand she that had been holding his with came to rest on the back of the palm against her cheek as he smiled down at her. In that one instant, she saw that he understood. Issei understood that she just couldn't open herself up like that yet, that it would take time. That smile said to her that while he'd wait until she was ready to vocalize it, he'd still give her what she wanted in the meantime. To feel like she mattered to him just as much as any of the others, if not more so. I know you think it's wrong, but I care about the two of you very much, and I want you to be a part of my life for as long as you're willing. Once you are ready, I'll tell you just how much. Without giving her any chance to respond, Issei lowered himself towards her. For a brief second, Yui tried to back her head away from his before she caught herself. This is what she wanted, there was no reason to shy away now. She closed her eyes just before his lips made contact with hers. Once they had, Yui wondered what she was so afraid of. The only time she'd ever felt even slightly hurt by Issei was when he lied about the devils. He'd never aimed to hurt her. They started off chaste, just a light touching of one pair of lips on another. The warmth and relief Yui felt gave her the courage to go for more. Her hands came up and grabbed the sides of his face, holding him in place, letting him know that she wanted more. The pressure between them increased a bit, and Yui opened her lips, taking things a step further than Kaori had so far. Their tongues danced against each other's for what seemed like hours. Moving, twirling, tasting, it was a blur to them as they each got lost in this new aspect of their relationship. Yui knew that she'd regress into her fears once the morning came, so she wanted to be at least one more step ahead of Kaori before then. She grasped the hand held to her cheek, dragging it against her yellow-buttoned pajama shirt. Yui brought it down to the hem and slid underneath. She wanted to squirm at the feeling of his hand lightly skimming her bare skin. Hip to stomach, stomach to torso, torso to chest. His touch felt like a small electric current before it came to rest where she was aiming. His fingers brushed against the underside of her, sweeping from her sternum towards her side. She gasped into the feeling was different than she'd expected. It was like Issei was caressing her very heart as the nerves fired off. She felt his excitement renew as it brushed against the top of her left thigh. He cupped her, letting her feel the warmth of his larger hand before giving a light squeeze. Breathless and in need of air, the two pulled apart. Her pink eyes looked into his light brown, almost copper. Yui was surprised by how well she was taking their position. She didn't feel like she was subjugated, controlled by him, like she thought her first experience of this kind would be. She welcomed it. Like this, she could say anything, do anything. Tell me, Issei. I need to hear you say it. Even to her own ears, her voice had never sounded seductive like it did right now. His glazed eyes refocused onto her as he caught his breath. Another squeeze to her, and he smiled, inching closer but no contact being made. I love you, katase. Even if you can't say it yet, I know you love me too. I want to make you happy, I want you to be happy. I want to. He couldn't say any more as she had leaned up to him again. The only ones that mattered right now were the two of them. The devils be damned, the world be damned, right now he was hers. They had passionately, they explored each other's bodies as much as she was comfortable with through their hands. For tonight, they were just other. Line break. When she woke up in the morning, Yui didn't care about her topless state, or the warm object she felt prodding her from the gap between her thighs yet again. In a state of fading bravery, she rolled her hips backwards. The warmth from the protrusion could be felt even through both articles of thin cloth that were their underwear. As her hips rolled forward to their original place, her breath hitched as a particular spot was caressed. She wanted to do it again, but her strength had drained away, and it was time to get up. She hadn't returned the words, but in time she would. Until then, she was more than happy to just enjoy the affection given to her. Buttoning her pajama shirt, Issei started to wake, and a realization came to her. Her groan brought him to open his eyes and look at her. Something wrong? Issei asked innocently. Buttons secured, Yui put her face in her hands. I'm in a harem. The words made it sound like her very life was ending. Sitting up, Issei tilted his head. His two girls considered a harem. She watched as Issei tried to hide his morning wood, moving the blankets to his lap. With a shake of her head and a sigh, Yui turned to get ready for school. Sometimes, you're an idiot. She saw his lopsided grin as he stood up, apparently deeming his condition dealt with. I love you too, Yui. It was clear that Issei wanted to make her more comfortable with the words being tossed around, but just as she thought last night, the words felt like hardening cement in her mouth, and she couldn't say them. Instead, she turned around, flicking him in the center of the forehead, before a quick and light on the lips. Line break. In the student council office, Sona stared at her friend with wide, unbelieving eyes, her glasses nearly falling from her face. How her voice was quiet, the disbelief clear in her tone. Surely there was another explanation here. Alcohol or drugs being the main ones coming to mind. But neither Reya nor Issei were that type of person. Sona knew that for a fact. Purehead devils were also resistant to such human things, so it was impossible that she'd been drugged by someone else. It's the only explanation I can come up with, Sona. It was too specific to be anything else, Reya said, her bright red face turned to the side, unable to look at her friend. Issei had somehow channeled her oldest family trait, one that neither she or her sister were too attuned with. Her mother, being from the now extinct Gop house, being the cause of that. It was there, just in a very diluted way, an occasional thought that was easily pushed aside. It was how Sona reasoned that her sister felt the need to wear such revealing costumes all the time. Clearing her throat, Sona pushed for more information. And then she had felt the change in Issei yesterday afternoon. It wasn't that rare of an occurrence really, but it happened mostly at night when she figured he was asleep. The one she felt yesterday was easily more potent than any of the others. Sona thought that maybe Reya's had accidentally shown more than she meant to. Reya's pulled her crossed arms tighter against herself. The traits mixed. Having regained her composure, Sona placed her chin against steepled hands. Mixed what does she? The light bulb went off, and suddenly she knew why Reya's was so embarrassed. With a controlled tone, hiding the amusement she felt from Reya's being on the other end for once, Sona asked Reya's the most important question. Did you have with my pawn? Reya shook her head violently. No. The embarrassment doubled, and the Gremory heiress mumbled something not even a devil's ears could pick up. Come again. Those had apparently been the wrong words to use, as Reya's looked like she was about to cry from how mortified she was. I didn't hear you, Reya. Please repeat what you said, Sona said, using words that in no way could be misunderstood. It's slow. Sona understood how admitting that to someone else could be embarrassing if they were human or had been. But devils had no such barriers in regards to masturbating. Hell, her sister had given her a live step-by-step tutorial when she was 10. That was a memory she wanted to erase from her mind, to the point that she'd asked around for someone to alter her memories. No one would. They all just laughed at her. Something in the wording seemed off though. When you got home, Reya shook her head. The clubroom in the old school building. She shook her head again. Sona was running out of places she thought Reya would be comfortable doing such a thing. Akino's shrine. Reya snapped her head towards her, embarrassed tears flinging from her eyes as she shouted. In the store I fingered myself on the floor of a manga shop's porn section, knees bent, spread open, 3 knuckles deep for IsseixSona. I came so hard it soaked the chest portion of my dress when I squirted. I kept twitching from it, rubbing my nipples with each step. I was in such a haze afterwards. I didn't even realize what I'd done until this morning. Sona was of two minds at the moment. One side acknowledged that this was indeed a horribly embarrassing incident, caused by something no devil knew could happen. But on the other side it was quite possibly the funniest thing she'd ever heard. Finally, Reya had something even close to her most embarrassing moment. She would readily admit that Reya had gotten the award on this one. mostly because she'd done it on the floor of a dirty store. There was one more thing she wanted to know. First off, is such a harsh term. Secondly, where was Eyes? Putting her face in her hands, Reya sat back down in her chair, having stood up as she ranted. Surely Reya had done that once Issei had left the room right in front of me. It was the weakest she'd ever heard Reya speak. Saw Sona asked hesitantly. Issei saw everything. Crossing her arms, Sona gave Reya her hindsight advice. I think having with him would have been the better choice. Issei never held the same disdain for Monday that the rest of the school seemed to. Today especially, he was up and ready to go. Sure, school sucked, but the people around him made it enjoyable. His date with Reya yesterday and the events with Yui last night revitalized him. Sitting at the table, surprisingly, was all 5 residents of the Hayadu household. His father was seated at the head, sipping on his coffee and reading the paper before heading to work. His mother had just taken the spot to his right after placing their breakfast on the table. She looked especially pleased, seeing a full table all ready to dig into her labors. She had been watching carefully, making sure that her husband didn't have any more outbursts, especially not with the girls at the table. He'd been better lately, but it was better safe than sorry. She didn't want to be caught off guard like that again. The hot frying pan in her hand had almost met the top of his head when Issei walked into the room. He wasn't even facing the same direction as their son, but somehow knew Issei was there. His face twisted into a scowl as Issei clipped on the bracelet she was sure he'd lost ages ago. Just as quick as that scowl formed, it was gone, and she let the pan back down to the stove. Hey Dad, how long is this project supposed to last anyway? Issei asked once he sat down at the opposite end, Yui and Kaori to each of his sides. Setting the mug down on the table, Koji lowered the paper to speak with his son. Not a clue. Every time we think all the details are finalized, the buyer changes one detail or another. What they need 500 different material compositions is beyond me, he answered, before going back to the paper. His father was an acquisition specialist. He handled larger orders brought in, seeking the materials or services for whatever their customer needed. This particular order had been in the works for a while now. It sounded like it originated from a cosplay company. They wanted mock armor pieces, staffs of different and specific designs, eyeglasses, shields, swords. Every item on the list had a very specific material composition to it. His father seemed to be having a hard time finding places to make all of it within a reasonable amount of time. You're leaving already? Don't your classes start at 9? It's only 7:45. His mother asked, as Issei stood up, grabbing his plate to be cleaned. The others were all still in the middle of their meal. The 2 girls didn't look like they were planning to head out anytime soon either. The walk to Kyoto Academy only took 20 minutes, and that's if you had to stop at each and every intersection for traffic. Rinsing the plate off to clean easier, Issei turned towards his family. Yay, I have to meet up with the VP. We're handing out eval forms to all the classes to get input on how the co-ed thing is working. They need to be filed and tallied before the summer break. Setting her utensils down, his mother tapped her chin, curious about something about his school that she hadn't heard about yet. It sounds like the vice president does all the work. Where is the president in all of this? Drying his hands off with the freshly washed hand towels, Issei walked to the fridge to grab a bottle of water to go. On some sort of study abroad program apparently. She's supposed to be coming back for the fall term. What was her name again? Issei twirled the bracelet around his wrist, something he did when lost in thought. Isla something Baleno, Billo Belize. He stood there, the women of the house watching him try to remember when Mr. Hayadu spoke without really thinking about what the outcome would be. Billet, snapping his fingers, giving a thankful smile towards his father for helping him get the name right. It wouldn't do for him to not know who the leader of the student council technically was. That's it. Wait, how'd you know that? Is she well known or something? Slamming down the last quarter cup of coffee he had, Koji Hayadu scrambled to get himself out of there before too many questions could be asked. Would you look at the time? Better head to work. Love you, honey. See you later, kids. Only grabbing his wallet and keys, he bolted out of the front door like a man possessed, forgetting his briefcase that held the details of what he needed to work on this morning. Kaori and Yui glanced from Issei to the direction his father had gone, just as confused as he was at what had just happened. His mother, though, held a terrifyingly familiar look. Her face was absolutely blank, the happy air around her evaporating like water on hot coal. The girls didn't know what to make of it when they saw Issei suddenly shrinking back, away from the woman he loved above almost everything else. Issei managed to swallow his fear enough to try and speak. That look she had, it brought phantom pains of a day a long time ago, one he'd never forget and never wanted to repeat. Yume Mom. Her eyes never moved, nor did her body. Girls, please go get ready for school. Yui and Kaori were worried from the tone of her voice and the way it made Issei start to shake lightly, his eyes fixed on her back. The woman that sat before them was not the same warm and caring one they'd come to know and love. Right now, she was frigid, like she wanted nothing more than to cut all ties with everyone around her. The only thing they had to do was to grab their bags from upstairs. But there was no way they were about to disobey Hanoka Hayadu right now. Leaving Issei to whatever fate was to befall him, they got up and went to sit in the guest room they'd taken over. D-Drag had been woken up by the bombardment of fear coursing through his host. The Red Dragon was taking it easy the last few weeks, letting Elsha handle most aspects of his training. He would take over once things got serious, once there was an opponent that was worthy of his attention. Issei was also very attached to the previous host, for reasons Dreg still didn't understand. The young man didn't answer, too shaken, and not willing to take his undivided attention away from his mother. Issei. He flinched as she spoke to him, more frightened right now than he had been in a long time. Yai's mother. Dreg watched as his host slipped into a more distant and formal pattern than he'd seen since meeting Issei. It took more work on the dragon's part to be aware of the current surroundings, thanks to the bracelet. They had discovered that Fafnir's bracelet was only supposed to dull the senses, not completely turn them down to human levels. Being that Issei had first placed it on his left wrist, which was his dominant hand, it completely sealed him off. The boosted gear may be attached to his soul, but the power still originated from his left hand. Issei was not yet powerful enough to overcome the seals placed on the jewelry, but at least with it on his right wrist, Dreg and Elsha could communicate with him if they just concentrated a bit harder. The heightened emotions of his host were helping Dreg get past the magic. Sit. She pointed towards the chair his father had just vacated. Slowly, shakily, Issei complied. Once he did, his eyes stayed on the table. He heard his mother move, and something coming to rest on the table, just out of view. Look at me. She had her elbow on the table, her fingers curled in except for her pinky finger. Issei felt his stomach drop, as his heart felt like it would burst. He didn't want to do this. He loved it when he was a little kid, because it made him feel like an adult. But no, felt like he was staring down a firing squad. It felt like he was moving in slow motion, as he put his own hand on the table, ever so slowly linking his pinky with hers. His hand was sweating as she tightened their locked fingers together. Now, no lies, understood. He nodded weakly. Have you used the computer recently? His tongue was lead in his mouth, as his body started to feel a case of vertigo come over it. Yes. Her eyes narrowed. When, Tuesday and Wednesday, for my econ paper. His mother linked their fingers together a little harder. Anything else? Issei shook his head no. This felt just like before. It was like she hated him all over again. Teether Issei cleared his throat. There was a pop-up though, a full-screen one. He could see her jaw clench, obviously understanding. Be descriptive, but not vulgar. Issei had to wonder if her dragon tamer trait was making him even more afraid of disappointing her now, because it certainly felt that way. It was one of those webcam sites. The girl was dancing before she started taking off clothes. It was a loop video, and started over when she was naked and laid on the bed. He could see her nostrils flaring a bit. She was very upset right now. Did you do anything that would bring that pop-up to our computer? Issei immediately shook his head. No, mother. It was like his finger was being pressed in a vice right now, as his mother seemed to develop supernatural strength. Do not lie to me. This would be the 4th time since you started high school. I'm sick of lies. She hissed. Hearing that from her was like a shot to the heart. Issei never wanted to lie to her if the situations weren't beyond normal human things. He really should have expected her to know he'd lied about the youth leader trip that was actually his training with Tannen. The others were small and inconsequential, but still lied. He didn't know why his father was lashing out at him. And yes, it did hurt. His light body's shaking returned, and he couldn't maintain eye contact. I'm not lying. I closed it without clicking on anything else. I swear, mother. He would pray, if it wouldn't cause him a migraine, that his mother wouldn't dig any deeper into anything else. Fine. He slowly let out the breath that he'd been holding onto. Where did you go for Golden Week? When he flinched, her grip became tighter, her other fist clenched. Issei stayed silent. He couldn't lie to her, so his only option was to not answer. They hadn't done this in a long time, but when he was 5 they agreed to only tell the truth during the pinky promise conversations. It was how she found out about him looking at porn in the first place, when he was a kid. Answer me. He wanted to. Issei wanted to tell her anything she wanted to know, but he was afraid of what would happen if she found out he'd become a creature that resided in the lake of fire, in hell. Mother, please. But he couldn't. Those were the rules as laid out by Sona. Humans couldn't be made aware of the supernatural, unless they were affiliated in some way. You are my son. I have every right to know what it is you're doing, Jevon, more so, if it's leading you down the wrong path. How do I know that you're not out there committing crimes? When you say you're doing school functions, how do I know that the cops won't be here to arrest you for Yule harassment or rape? She exploded, both of their pinky fingers nearly turning blue from the force of her grip. Old habits die hard. Her husband had apparently been browsing the internet for naked, young women again. Was she not good enough for him, not attractive enough, too old, not willing to do whatever strange thing he was into? The anger brought about by his actions had quickly been shifted onto figuring out why her son had been lying to her about a few things. The underworld, Issei said quietly. Hanoka Hayato stopped, looking at her son like he was crazy. Excuse me. Issei gathered the courage to look his mother in the eyes and tell her the truth. I went to the underworld, hell, during Golden Week. I was training to get stronger, to fight a devil. It was the truth, but he knew that without further context, it just sounded crazy. Get out. She threw his hand away from her, standing up violently, sending the chair down to the ground. Issei stared at her, wide-eyed, her anger mixed with the frustration. Her eyes were becoming shot as tears built up. Why, her voice shook as she tried to hold it together just a bit longer. Why are you lying to me? What are you hiding? He heard the stairs creak. One or both of the girls must have been standing there. His mother didn't notice it and kept escalating into a frantic state. Is it drugs? Are you in a gang? Do the girls know? Is that why they all want to be with you? She covered her mouth with her hands, her voice was muffled by the shaky appendages. Is this payback for how awful I was to you because I beat you? Issei heard 2 gasps from the stairs, then saw a flash of blue come from the living room. Issei might not hate every Monday, but he sure hated this one.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.